The morning Silas Crow rode onto Caleb Voss's land, he didn't knock. He didn't call out. He simply dismounted at the fence line, walked through the gate like he owned every inch of ground beneath his boots, and stopped in front of the three ranch hands who were mending the east pasture rail. "Tell your boss," Silas said, loud enough that his two men behind him could hear, loud enough that it would be repeated later in every corner of Red Hollow, that a man who marries a stray dog deserves to lose everything he built. One of the hands, a young man named Porter, who'd been with Caleb 6 years, straightened up from the fence post and looked at Silas without blinking. "Mr. Voss isn't here right now." "I know he isn't," Silas smiled. "That's why I'm telling you." He turned and walked back through the gate, leaving it open behind him. That moment, that open gate, that deliberate insult left in the cold morning air, would become the thing people talked about for years afterward. Not because of what Silas Crow did next, but because of what he had never understood about the man he was trying to destroy, and the woman standing quietly inside the ranch house who had already heard every word. If you've ever been looked at like you don't belong somewhere you've earned with your own hands, if you've ever watched someone dismiss everything you are without a second glance, then you already know what this story is about before it even begins. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't, hit the like button, and drop a comment with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happens next in Red Hollow is the kind of thing people don't forget. The valley that cradled Red Hollow was not a forgiving place. It never had been. The land ran hard against the Bitterroot foothills, rocky and clay-dry in summer and brutal under snowpack from November through March, and the people who had stayed long enough to call it home had done so through stubbornness more than anything resembling grace. They were practical people, unsentimental about most things, and one of the things they had been most unsentimental about, for as long as anyone could remember, was Caleb Voss. Caleb had built the Voss Ranch from 40 acres of near-worthless scrubland that his father had purchased for back taxes and a bottle of rye. That was the story, anyway. The version people told new arrivals, usually with a slight shake of the head, that was part admiration and part something harder to name. What they left out of that story was the decade of punishing work it had taken to turn those 40 acres into 320. The winters Caleb had worked through alone, the debts he'd quietly paid off, the 2 hired hands he'd kept on payroll through a bad season when other ranchers in the valley had let their men go without ceremony or apology. He was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been made for a different, rougher century. He didn't talk much in groups, which people in Red Hollow tended to read as arrogance, though anyone who'd spent real time with him knew it was closer to the opposite. Caleb Voss was a man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying, and he'd simply noticed over the years that most conversations didn't clear that bar. The business with the daughters had started the previous spring. It had not been his idea. That was the first thing to understand. The 10 families, the Hargroves, the Bellamys, the Kents, the Prices, and 6 others whose names would matter later, had convened something that wasn't quite a meeting but functioned like one, held over 2 evenings at the Bellamy house under the pretense of discussing the upcoming cattle drive season. What they were actually discussing was Caleb Voss and the fact that a man with his land holdings and no wife and no heir was, as Daniel Hargrove had put it with his particular brand of tactless honesty, a problem waiting to happen. "If something goes wrong with him," Hargrove had said, "that land goes into probate. And if it goes into probate, Silas Crow starts circling." Everyone in the room had understood what that meant. Silas Crow had been circling the Voss land for 11 years. He'd made 2 offers, both reasonable on paper, both constructed in ways that would have left Caleb with cash and no leverage. And both times Caleb had declined without much explanation. Silas had not taken it well either time. A man like Silas Crow did not take things well when they didn't go in his direction. So the families had decided, in their roundabout way, that the solution was a wife. And since they were the families with daughters of appropriate age, they had each put forward a name. The introductions had been arranged over the course of 3 months. Each family had hosted a dinner or an afternoon gathering, or in the case of the Prices, an inexplicable outdoor picnic in 40-degree weather that Caleb had endured with stoic politeness before excusing himself after 40 minutes. He had been courteous to every woman he met. He had asked reasonable questions, listened carefully to the answers, and walked away from every single one of them without any stated intention of returning. People had begun whispering about it by August. By September, the whispers had sharpened into something closer to talk. The daughters themselves, for the most part, seemed more relieved than wounded, being passed over by a man that Sirius was not entirely a loss. But their fathers were a different matter. There was an insult in it that the men of Red Hollow found difficult to absorb. Caleb Voss had been given 10 options, all of them respectable, and he had chosen none of them. It suggested a standard that none of them could identify, which was, in its way, more offensive than any specific criticism. What no one knew, because Caleb hadn't told anyone and wouldn't until much later, was that his rejections had nothing to do with the women themselves. He had liked several of them. Margaret Hargrove was sharp and funny in a way she worked to conceal in polite company, and he'd respected that she didn't try to perform softness she didn't have. The youngest Price daughter, Clara, had talked knowledgeably about soil composition for 20 minutes at that freezing picnic, and he'd found himself genuinely interested in what she was saying. They were good women, capable women, but every conversation he'd had, every dinner and afternoon and awkward supervised walk, had carried the same undercurrent. This was a transaction. A reasonable, socially sanctioned transaction between families with aligned interests, dressed up in the language of courtship. The women knew it, he knew it, and somewhere in the gap between what was being said and what was actually happening, Caleb had kept waiting for something. He couldn't have named it exactly. That never arrived. He hadn't been looking for beauty. He hadn't been looking for family name or land or the social benefit of a well-connected marriage. He hadn't even been fully certain what he was looking for, which was part of why he'd agreed to the introductions in the first place. He found out on a Tuesday morning in October, when he rode the long way back from the north pasture and passed the turnoff to the Whitlock place. He'd known the property existed, everyone did, in the distant, unexamined way people know about things that don't touch their daily life. The Whitlock land was 12 acres at the far eastern edge of the valley, up against the tree line where the terrain got uneven and the soil turned thin. It had belonged to a man named Eli Whitlock, who had come to Red Hollow about 15 years back, built a small house, kept mostly to himself, and died of a fever 4 winters ago, leaving the property to his daughter. The daughter was Mara. Caleb had seen her twice before, once at the general store in town, once at the edge of the market during the fall trading days, and both times she had conducted her business quickly and left without stopping to talk to anyone. He'd registered her the way you register someone moving through the peripheral edge of a day that has other demands on it. A quiet woman, practical looking, not someone who appeared to need anything from the town or expect anything from it either. That Tuesday morning, he didn't stop at the turnoff. He rode on, but he thought about it. He thought about the way she'd handled herself at the market, not the particular details of it, which he could barely recall, but the quality of her presence. The sense that she was someone who occupied her space without making noise about it. He'd been around enough people who needed the room to know about them, who performed their own importance for any available audience, that the absence of it in someone struck him now the way silence struck you after too long around machinery. He went back the following Saturday. He had not planned what to say. That was not a strategy or a romantic gesture. It was simply that he didn't know what the appropriate opening was for knocking on the door of a woman he had no introduction to, in a social landscape where introduction was everything. He knew that showing up unannounced at a single woman's property would be remarked upon if anyone saw it, and he was far enough past the point of caring about remarks that this didn't stop him, but he still had no plan. She answered the door before he finished knocking. She'd been working. That much was visible immediately. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow despite the October cold, and there was a smear of something dark across the back of her right hand that looked like axle grease. She held a short-handled tool he recognized after a second as a farrier's rasp. Her expression when she saw him was not surprised, exactly. It was more like the expression of someone who had been expecting an interruption of some kind and was reserving judgment on whether this particular one was worth their time. "Caleb Voss," she said. "You know who I am." "Most people in the valley do." She didn't say it unkindly, just stated it, the way you'd state the weather. "Can I come in?" She looked at him for a moment. Not the performed hesitation of a woman calculating social positioning, just an actual, uncomplicated look, the kind that was trying to figure out whether he was worth the trouble of a conversation. "What for?" she asked. And that was it. That was the thing he hadn't been able to identify across all those dinners and introductions and carefully arranged afternoons. Not one of those women had asked him what for. They'd welcomed him in with varying degrees of warmth and strategy and hope, because that was what you did when Caleb Voss came to call, because Caleb Voss was the kind of man you welcomed in. Mara Whitlock had looked at him and asked what for. "I'd like to talk to you," he said, "if you're willing." She considered this for another moment. Then she stepped back and let him through. The house was small and very clean and organized with the particular efficiency of someone who had arranged everything to serve a purpose and had no interest in arrangements that didn't. There were tools on the wall hooks, sorted by use. A work table along the eastern wall that held a partially disassembled piece of harness hardware and the components of something Caleb identified after a moment as a water pump valve. Books on a shelf. Actual books, not decorative ones, spines cracked and pages swollen from handling. A wood stove with a good fire in it that had clearly been burning since early morning. She sat down at the work table without offering him a seat, and then, apparently catching herself, gestured at the chair near the stove. He sat. "You've been through the introduction circuit," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And none of them suited you?" "No." She turned the farrier's rasp over in her hand, not working with it, just holding it. "So you thought you'd come out here?" "I thought I'd come talk to you." "Because I'm the last option." "Because you're not an option anyone arranged," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him steadily. He had the sense that she was accustomed to people either looking away from her or looking at her with something loaded in the look. Pity or wariness, or the particular kind of contempt that people reserved for someone who hadn't fit where they were expected to fit. He tried to just look at her, the way you looked at a piece of land you were genuinely trying to understand. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "How you've managed this place alone for 4 years." That was not what she'd expected. He could see it. Not surprise exactly, but a slight recalibration. You could have asked anyone in town that. "I'm asking you." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of two people deciding, simultaneously, whether to take a thing seriously. She told him. Not everything. Not that first day. But enough. The first winter after her father died had nearly finished her. The soil on her acreage was poor but workable if you understood its particular deficiencies, and she'd spent the better part of a year figuring those out through trial and failure and reading every agricultural text she could get her hands on. She'd learned to work the horses herself because she couldn't afford to hire it done. She'd learned the water table on her property intimately, out of necessity, tracking the seasonal shifts in the springs and identifying where moisture moved underground through the root systems of the trees at the edge of her land. She talked about all of it the way someone talks about technical problems they have solved. Not with pride, not with performance. Just with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone accustomed to being the only person in the room who needed to understand something. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat for a moment. "Do you know the terrain north of the Bitterroot line?" he asked. "Above the tree line where it flattens out before the second ridge?" She looked at him carefully. "Some of it." "Why?" "Because I've been trying to figure out where the water goes in late summer when the creek drops. I think there's a secondary drainage path up there that I haven't been able to locate." "There is," she said. "It cuts east toward the Crow property boundary and then drops into an underground channel. I found it 3 summers ago." He stayed another hour. He came back the following Wednesday. By the third visit, he had made up his mind. Not in a dramatic fashion, not with a speech or a declaration. He simply knew, the way you know when a solution to a problem you've been working on quietly clicks into a shape that makes sense. Mara Whitlock was not who anyone in Red Hollow would have chosen for him. She was not who he would have described if someone had asked him to describe what he was looking for, because he hadn't known how to describe it. But she was exactly the thing he'd been waiting for and hadn't had a name for. He asked her on the 4th visit, directly, without preamble, because he'd learned already that preamble was not something she had patience for. "I'd like you to come to the ranch," he said. "As my wife, if you're willing. Not because of the land, not because of what it would look like, because I think we'd be useful to each other, and I think there's more to that than most people give it credit for." Mara set down the tool she was holding. "That's not exactly a romantic proposal," she said. "No," he agreed. She was quiet for a long moment. He didn't try to fill it. "I'd want to know the terms," she said finally. Of the arrangement. What's mine? What's shared? What happens if it doesn't work? That's fair, he said. I'll have it put down in writing if you want. She looked at him with that same direct, weighing look he'd gotten at the door on his first visit. You're not what people say you are, she said. Neither are you, he said. She said yes. The news reached Red Hollow before Caleb did. He wasn't certain how. Small valleys had their own communication systems, faster than telegraph and less accurate, running on the fuel of other people's astonishment. But by the time he rode into town to file the necessary paperwork with the county clerk, the story had already been through 3 versions, each more incredulous than the last. He had turned down the Hargrove girl. He had turned down the Bellamy girl. He had sat across the table from 10 women whose families ran the backbone of Red Hollow's social and economic structure. And he had quietly declined every single one of them. And he had chosen Mara Whitlock, the woman who lived out past the East Tree Line, the woman whose father had died owing 2 people money he never paid back, the woman who hadn't attended a church service or a town social or any event of collective significance in 4 years, the woman people described, when they described her at all, with words like odd and solitary and strange, as if these were moral failings rather than simply the qualities of a person who had decided that belonging to Red Hollow was not worth the price Red Hollow charged for it. The laughter started at the feed store. Caleb heard it when he was leaving. Not directed at him, not quite, but not entirely hidden either. 2 men talking in the way men talk when they want you to know they're talking about you. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He rode home. Mara was in the north pasture when he got back, walking the fence line with the careful attention of someone cataloging what needed repair. She'd arrived that morning with 1 trunk and a crate of books and a horse. She'd clearly put serious work into conditioning. She hadn't asked for help unloading any of it. He stopped his horse at the edge of the pasture and watched her for a moment. This woman who had said yes to an unusual question for reasons he suspected had less to do with him specifically and more to do with the fact that she'd run out of options that didn't require her to be smaller than she was. That was all right. He hadn't married her because she needed rescuing. He'd married her because she was the first person in Red Hollow who had asked him what for. She looked up and saw him watching. The northeast corner post is rotted through, she called across the pasture. You'll lose that section of fence before spring if you don't replace it. I know, he called back. I've been getting to it. You should get to it faster, she said, and went back to her inspection. He dismounted. He didn't know yet what the winter would bring. I didn't know about the crops that would fail, the cattle that would go missing, the blizzard that would come down off the Bitterroot Range and cut the valley off from the outside world for 11 days. He didn't know about Silas Crow and the open gate and the things that would be said in the months ahead. He knew the northeast corner post was rotted through. He went to get the replacement timber. The northeast corner post took 2 days to replace properly. Caleb had expected to do it alone, the way he'd done most things on the ranch for the better part of a decade. On the first morning, he loaded the replacement timber onto the flatbed, hitched the draft horse, and drove out to the fence line before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. He found Mara already there. She had a post-hole digger in her hands and had already broken the frozen crust of the ground around the rotted post's base. She was not making quick work of it. The earth was hard and the digger kept catching on rock. But she was making steady work of it, which was different. You don't need to do that, he said. The ground's harder than it looks, she said, not stopping. If you start the new post without clearing the old root structure, it'll lean by spring. He stood there for a moment, then got down from the flatbed and picked up the other digger leaning against the fence rail. They worked side by side without talking much. That was the first thing Caleb noticed about working with Mara. She didn't fill silence with noise. Most people, when they were uncomfortable or uncertain, manufactured conversation. Mara simply worked, and the silence between them was the practical silence of 2 people doing a job, not the strained silence of 2 people who had run out of things to say. They got the post set by mid-afternoon. Mara tested the alignment with the level she'd brought from her trunk without being asked, found it a 1/4 inch off, and they reset it. When it was done, she stood back and looked at it with the expression of someone checking a column of figures, not admiring a finished product. That'll hold, she said. Yes, he said. They walked back to the ranch in the cooling late afternoon light, and that was the second day of Mara Whitlock living at the Voss Ranch. The town's opinion arrived faster than the cold did. It came through Porter first, who had the particular bad luck of being the most sociable of Caleb's hands, and therefore the one most likely to pick up what was circulating in Red Hollow when he went in for supplies. He came back from a Thursday run with a careful look on his face that Caleb recognized as the look of a man carrying something he'd been told not to carry. "Just say it," Caleb told him, in the barn where they were sorting the supply delivery. Porter set down a feed sack. "The Hargrove family's saying you've gone simple," he said. "Their words. Daniel Hargrove specifically. He said—" Porter paused, clearly editing. "He said a man with your holdings throwing himself at a woman nobody wanted is the same as burning money in a field." "What else?" "The Bellamy family's not saying as much out loud, but Mrs. Bellamy told the dry goods clerk that she pities you." Porter picked the feed sack back up. "And Silas Crow was at the saloon last week, apparently saying that he gives you 2 years before you're willing to sell." Caleb didn't answer. He kept sorting. "The men aren't saying much," Porter offered. "Most of them figure it's your business. Holt thinks you're crazy, but he's thought that since the thing with the river easement anyway. Where does Mara stand in all of this?" Porter's expression shifted into something more complicated. "I think they're saying worse things about her than about you," he said. "I didn't hear all of it, but what I heard wasn't kind." Caleb had known this. He'd known it before he rode out to her property, before he sat in her clean, organized house and listened to her talk about water tables and soil composition. He'd known that bringing Mara Whitlock into the social structure of Red Hollow would not go smoothly, because Red Hollow did not absorb outsiders smoothly under the best circumstances, and Mara was not merely an outsider. She was a reminder that the Valley's network of families and alliances and marriages had failed to account for her, had not known what to do with her, had simply moved around her the way water moves around a stone and pretended the stone wasn't there. He went to find her. She was in the small back room off the kitchen that had been used for storage before she'd quietly reorganized it into what appeared to be a working space. She had her books spread across the work table alongside a map, hand-drawn, detailed in a way that suggested she'd made it herself, of terrain he recognized as the Upper Eastern Valley. "You heard," he said. It wasn't a question. "Porter's not quiet," she said, not looking up. "Does it bother you?" She was quiet for a moment, then, "Which part?" "Any of it." She looked up then. Her expression was not hurt, and it was not indifferent. It was something more specific than either, the look of a person who had calculated the cost of something long before paying it and was therefore not surprised by the bill. "What they say about me I've been hearing in one version or another for 4 years," she said. "What they say about you." She paused. "That bothers me more. You chose this." "I chose it knowing what people would say." "Knowing and living with it are different things." "Yes," he said. "They are." She looked at him for another moment, then back at the map. "Come look at this," she said. "I want to show you something." He crossed to the table. The map covered the terrain from the Voss North pasture up through the tree line and into the foothills, rendered in pencil with careful notations he had to lean in to read. She'd marked water sources, springs, seasonal runoff channels, the underground drainage path she'd mentioned on his 3rd visit, with a system of symbols she'd apparently invented, since he didn't recognize them from any standard notation. "This is the secondary drainage," she said, pointing to a line that ran northeast from a point above his north pasture. "It drops underground here," her finger moved, "and resurfaces here, which is outside your property line. But the source is fed by snowmelt from this ridge, which means in a heavy winter you get volume, more than your creek can handle." "I know the creek floods in heavy winters," he said. "It doesn't just flood," she said. "It changes course. Not permanently, but enough. This happened in—" She checked a notation at the bottom corner of the map. "4 years ago, and again 2 winters back. Each time, the runoff from your north pasture went east instead of south, and it cut a channel through the low ground near the tree line that affected the drainage in your fields for the following growing season." He looked at the map more carefully. "How do you know this?" "Because the channel it cut ran through the edge of my property," she said. "I spent a season figuring out why my eastern field kept logging. It took me 3 months to trace it back to your drainage." He straightened. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" She looked at him with a patience that had a slight edge to it. "To whom?" He didn't have an answer for that. "The point is," she said, "if this winter is heavy, and the way the ridge looked last week, I think it will be, You need to redirect the north pasture runoff before the snow comes down. Otherwise, you lose the field drainage again, and this time you also lose the root structure in the south crop bed because the soil will be saturated through April. He studied the map for a long moment. She was right. He could see it now, could trace the logic of the water movement through the terrain he'd walked for 15 years, and somehow never read the way she was reading it. "What do you propose?" he said. "A diversion channel," she said. "Not complicated. 20 feet of cut in the right place redirects the flow south toward your existing drainage instead of east. If we do it before the ground freezes solid, it'll hold." "We have maybe 3 weeks," he said. "Then we should start Monday," she said. That was the beginning of the first real argument they had, which was not about the diversion channel itself, but about labor. Caleb wanted to hire 2 extra men to speed the work. Mara thought it was a waste of money they could use elsewhere. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour going back and forth about it, neither of them raising their voice, both of them entirely unwilling to concede, until Caleb said with some frustration, "I've been running this ranch for 15 years. I think I understand my own budget." And Mara said, with the flat evenness of someone stating a fact rather than winning a point, "Then you understand that if the crop drainage fails next spring, the cost of recovery is 4 times what 2 extra hands would cost you now." He hired 1 extra man. She accepted this without comment. The diversion channel took 8 days. They worked alongside Porter and the hired man and the ranch's 2 other hands, Decker and Cole, who were experienced workers but who handled Mara with the careful wariness of people unsure what to make of a woman who knew as much about the land as she appeared to know and who gave instructions without asking permission first. Decker had the particular problem of being a man who didn't like being told what to do by anyone he hadn't decided to respect yet, and it took until the 4th day, when Mara spotted a miscalculation in the channel's slope that would have sent the water the wrong direction and corrected it before anyone else caught it, for him to quietly rearrange his opinion. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. But after that, when she said something about the work, he listened without the slight delay he'd been using before. The town did not improve. The dinner invitation from the Hargroves was not extended. The Bellamys, who had been in the habit of sending seasonal gifts to the Voss Ranch, a practice more about maintaining good relations with a powerful neighbor than about genuine warmth, did not send anything that November. When Caleb and Mara went into Red Hollow together for the first time, to the general store and the post office, they moved through a current of looks and not quite whispers that Caleb felt with an unfamiliar physical discomfort, like a change in air pressure. Mara moved through it the way she moved through everything, steadily, without performing either indifference or distress. She bought what she needed at the store, spoke politely to the clerk, and did not acknowledge the 2 women across the room who had stopped their conversation and were watching her with the poorly concealed attention of people who had already decided what they were looking at. Outside, loading the supply crate into this wagon, Caleb said. "You've had practice at that." "At what?" "Not reacting." She considered this for a moment, hands on the crate. "I used to react," she said, "when I first came back here after my father died. I thought if I explained myself enough, if I was visible enough in the right ways, people would—" She stopped. "It didn't work, so I stopped trying." "Came back?" he said. "I didn't know you'd left." She was quiet for a second in the way that meant something was being considered, evaluated, measured for what it was safe to say. "I left when I was 16, she said. "I was gone for almost 4 years. He waited. "I'll tell you about it sometime," she said. "Not today." He didn't push. He was learning that with Mara, pushing was the surest way to close a door that would have opened on its own if you gave it time. The winter came in hard in early December, the way she'd predicted. Not immediately disastrous, just heavy, steady, relentless, the kind of cold that settled into the valley and made itself at home. The diversion channel held. Caleb watched the north pasture's runoff redirect exactly the way Mara had said it would, and he noticed, with a feeling he didn't name, that she didn't say anything about being right. It was the cattle that started disappearing in January. Not all at once. That would have been obvious, would have announced itself. Instead, it was gradual. 3 head missing from the south herd on a Tuesday, then 2 more the following week, then a gap in the east pasture count that Porter noticed during the morning check and reported with a look of confused worry on his face, as though he must have miscounted. He hadn't miscounted. Caleb went through every possibility systematically. Predators. He found no sign, no tracks, no carcasses. Fence breaches. He and Decker walked every line of the perimeter and found nothing that would have let cattle through. Rustling, possible, but rustling at that scale required organization, and Red Hollow was a small valley where organized rustling was the kind of thing that left traces. He said nothing to anyone in town. Not yet. Mara heard him up at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of him, running the numbers in a way that didn't change no matter how many times he ran them. She came out without a lamp, stood in the doorway a moment, then went to the stove and put the kettle on. "Tell me," she said, sitting down across from him. He told her. All of it. The missing counts, the lack of physical evidence, the financial math that said if the losses continued at their current rate through spring, he was looking at a serious shortfall in the fall market. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Where's the east pasture relative to the Crow property line?" she said. He looked up. "I'm not accusing anyone," she said. "I'm asking where the line is." 300 yards, he said. "Maybe 350. And the south herd? Further, half a mile." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Is there any point on your property where the terrain makes a natural corridor between your land and Crow's that wouldn't be visible from the main roads?" He thought about it. "There's a low section along the creek bed in the northwest corner," he said slowly. "Cottonwood cover. You couldn't see it from the road. Have you walked it recently?" "Not since fall." "I'll go tomorrow," she said. "I'll go with you." "One person makes less disturbance than two," she said, "and I'm quieter than you are." He started to object on the grounds that it was winter and the northwest creek bed was rough terrain, and she looked at him with an expression that reminded him, not gently, that she had spent a significant portion of her life navigating rough terrain in winter without his help or anyone else's. He closed his mouth. She left before first light. She was back by mid-morning, and the look on her face when she came through the door told him something before she said a word. Not alarm. She wasn't a person who alarmed easily, but a sharpness, a particular quality of attention that meant she had found something that mattered. "There's a cut fence," she said, pulling off her coat. "Single line, northwest corner, right where you said the cottonwood cover is. It's been cut and retied, not once, but several times. The wire at the repair points is shinier than the surrounding fence. Newer handling." "How long?" "Based on how the ground's disturbed around it, at least 6 weeks." 6 weeks. That put it in late November, before the worst of the winter set in, before Caleb would have had any reason to walk that section of fence. "There's hoof prints," she continued, "on both sides. They drove them through in small groups, 3, 4 at a time, small enough that you wouldn't notice the gap in a large herd count unless you were looking for it." Caleb sat with this for a moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire in the stove. "You're saying someone has been running my cattle through that gap onto the adjacent property," he said. "I'm saying someone has been running your cattle through that gap," she said. "Where they went from there, I don't know, but the adjacent property is Crow's." He stood up from the table. The anger came up clean and immediate, the way clean anger did. No fog in it, no confusion, just the cold, clear knowledge that something had been done to him deliberately and by someone who had calculated that he wouldn't notice in time. "I need to wire the county sheriff," he said. "Wait," Mara said. He stopped. "If you wire the sheriff today, Silas Crow knows within 24 hours that you've noticed," she said. "He'll move the cattle, or he'll have moved them already, and there'll be nothing on his land to find." "Then what do you suggest?" "Documentation," she said. "First. The fence, the tracks, the timing. We need it all written and witnessed before anyone outside this ranch knows we've found it. That takes time." 2 days, she said. "We can have it in 2 days." He looked at her for a long moment. She was right. He knew she was right, and he knew it with the particular frustration of a man whose instinct was to act, and who was being told, correctly, that acting immediately would cost him the thing he was trying to protect. 2 days, he said. They spent those 2 days carefully. Mara went back to the northwest corner with paper and a measuring line and documented the fence cut in enough detail that a person who'd never seen it could reconstruct exactly what had happened. She sketched the terrain, noted the hoof patterns, measured the gap in the wire at each repair point. Caleb went through his cattle records going back 4 months and marked every count, every gap, every date. Porter witnessed both sets of documentation and signed his name to them, which he did with the steady hand of a man who understood the weight of what he was putting his name on. On the evening of the second day, Mara sat at the kitchen table with all of it spread in front of her, organizing it into a sequence that told a story a sheriff could follow. Caleb sat across from her, watching her work. There was a lamp between them, and outside the wind was picking up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame, and he had the peculiar sensation of sitting inside something solid, while the world outside tried to shake it loose. "You've done this before," he said. "Organized evidence." She didn't look up. "Not like this, but something like it." A pause. "I told you I left when I was 16, she said, still not looking up. "You said you'd tell me sometime." She set down her pencil. She looked at her hands for a moment. There was that dark line under her thumbnail again, the permanent trace of outdoor work that never quite came out. And then she looked at him. "My father brought me to Red Hollow when I was 12, she said. "Before that, we were in the territories, moving around. He wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't a careful one, and we ended up in places that—" She paused. "When I was 16, he got into a land dispute with a man who had more money and more connections. It wasn't a fair fight. We lost the property we'd been working for 3 years. "What happened?" "I went back east," she said. "I had an aunt in Pennsylvania. I spent 4 years there, working, saving. I learned whatever anyone would teach me. The aunt was a practical woman. She didn't have patience for anything that wasn't useful." She almost smiled, not quite. "It was the best education I've ever had." "Then you came back." "My father was sick, and I—" She stopped, started again differently. "There wasn't anything left for me in the East either, so I came back. He died that winter." She picked up the pencil again. "The land was already in my name. He'd done that much." She went back to the documentation. Caleb sat with what she'd told him. Not the facts of it, which were straightforward enough, but the texture of it. A 16-year-old girl going east alone, 4 years of learning whatever anyone would teach her. Coming back to a place that had never wanted her, to a dying father, to 12 acres of thin-soiled land that most people would have sold for whatever they could get and walked away from. He thought about the organized tools on the wall hooks, the hand-drawn map with its careful notation system, the way she'd known, without being told, that one person makes less disturbance than two. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than what she'd just told him. They sent the wire to the county sheriff the next morning. The sheriff, a man named Aldous Birch, who had held the office for 12 years and who Caleb had dealt with twice before on minor matters, arrived 2 days later with a deputy and the careful face of a man who had learned not to look surprised by anything until he'd seen the evidence. Caleb took him through everything: the ledger records, Mara's documentation of the fence, Porter's witness statement. Birch was quiet for a long time, going through the papers. Then, "The fence is still cut?" "Retied," Mara said. "The way it's been each time they've used it. If you go now, you'll find it as I documented it." Birch looked at her with the measuring look of a man encountering someone he hadn't expected. "You're the one who found it?" "Yes." "You know this terrain?" "Well enough," she said. He went with his deputy and came back 2 hours later. He looked at Mara when he came through the door, not Caleb. "Everything is where you said it was," he told her. "I've noted it officially. This is going to take some time to pursue. There's no cattle on Crow's property currently that we can establish as yours without brand records, which we'll need." "The brand records are here," Caleb said. 5 years of them." "Then I'll need copies." Birch sat down at the table. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell you, Mr. Voss, that what you're getting into, if this is what it appears to be, is not a quick matter. Silas Crow has a lawyer in Billings and relationships with half the district court." "I know who Silas Crow has relationships with," Caleb said. "Then you know this will get worse before it gets better." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not interested in making it easy for him." Birch left with the documentation copies and a promise to return. After he was gone, the house was quiet, in the way that follows a significant thing. Not peaceful, just empty of immediate noise while everything continued to move beneath the surface. Mara went to the window and looked out at the gray sky. "He'll find out within the week," she said, "that you've filed with the sheriff." "I know." "He'll try to move against us before the legal process has time to run." "I know that too." She turned from the window. She looked tired. Not physically, but the kind of tired that came from being watchful for a long time without a break. Why aren't you more frightened? She said. He thought about it seriously, the way she'd asked it seriously. Because I'm not fighting him alone, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked away, out of the window again, at the hard gray winter that was settling itself over the valley with the patience of something that had no need to hurry. Outside, the wind picked up again. The window frame rattled. Neither of them moved to do anything about it. Down in Red Hollow, in the saloon where Silas Crow held his informal court 3 evenings a week, a man named Hetch, who worked a small property on the valley's western edge, was telling the story of how he'd seen Caleb Voss's new wife tramping around the northwest section of the Voss land 2 mornings ago in the snow, all by herself, carrying papers and a measuring line. Hetch told the story the way he told most stories, with the slightly aggrieved humor of someone who found other people's lives baffling. And the men around him laughed at the image of it, the solitary woman in the snow with her papers. Silas Crow did not laugh. He set down his glass and looked at the far wall with an expression that the men around him wouldn't have been able to interpret because they weren't paying close enough attention. He left the saloon 30 minutes later, earlier than his usual habit. The man who worked for him, a thin-faced man named Reeves, who had shown up in Red Hollow 2 years ago from somewhere nobody had ever pinned down, was waiting outside with their horses. Silas mounted without a word, and Reeves fell in beside him. "There's a problem," Silas said as they rode. Reeves said nothing. He was the kind of man who understood that his job was to listen until told otherwise. "Fix it," Silas said. The winter had 20 more days of hardness in it before it would ease. And in those 20 days, everything in Red Hollow that had been settling quietly into its new arrangement would get its first real test, and neither Caleb Voss nor Mara Whitlock had any way of knowing yet just how hard that test was coming. But Mara looked at the gray sky again before she turned from the window, and something in her expression, not fear, not quite, but the recognition of someone who had survived bad winters before and knew that surviving them required seeing them clearly, suggested she was making her own calculations. She had always been good at that. Reeves moved fast for a thin-faced man who didn't appear to have much urgency in him. Within 3 days of Silas leaving the saloon early, 2 things happened that Caleb could not immediately connect to each other. The first was that Porter came back from a supply run with the news that the feed store had suddenly decided it couldn't extend credit to the Voss Ranch for the spring order, a credit arrangement that had been in place for 7 years without interruption. The second was that Decker found the gate on the south pasture open one morning, the kind of open that didn't happen by accident, and 4 of the remaining herd had wandered out onto the road in the dark and had to be recovered from half a mile away before first light. Neither thing was catastrophic on its own. Together, they had the pattern of something deliberate, not a confrontation, which Silas Crow apparently wasn't ready for yet, but a pressure. A series of small frictions applied consistently, designed to wear down a man's resources and his patience before the larger blow landed. Caleb told Mara about the feed store credit over supper. She listened without reacting, and then she asked, "Who owns the feed store?" "Harmon Price." "Why?" "Because Harmon Price sold a section of his Eastland to Silas Crow 2 years ago," she said. "I remember hearing about it. The price was unusually good for that parcel." Caleb set down his fork. He hadn't known that. He should have known that. "You've been paying attention to things I haven't been paying attention to," he said. "I've been outside the town's notice for a long time," she said. "People talk around someone they've decided doesn't count. I heard a great deal." This was not something he'd considered, that Mara's years of deliberate invisibility in Red Hollow had functioned not just as a survival strategy, but as a kind of intelligence. She had sat outside the social structure for so long that she had watched it from the outside, which was the only angle from which you could see the whole shape of it. "Who else has Crow got connections with in town?" he said. "I'll write you a list," she said. She did. It took her 20 minutes, and when she handed it to him, he read it twice in silence. 6 names. 2 of them surprised him. One of them surprised him considerably. "Judge Farrow?" he said. "They hunt together," Mara said. "Every October, have for 8 years. The county judge. The man who would hear any legal proceeding involving the stolen cattle." Caleb put the paper down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment, working through the implications. "Birch doesn't know about the Farrow connection," he said. "Probably not," she said. "Or if he does, he's navigating around it carefully." I need to wire the territorial court, he said. Get this in front of someone who isn't inside Crow's circle. That'll take time we may not have, she said. And money. I know. And Crow will know we've escalated the moment we do it. I know that too. He looked at her. Do you have a better idea? She was quiet for a moment. Not better, she said. Just more immediate. Birch is honest. Whatever else he is, he's honest. And he knows you've got documentation. If we can get him to file a preliminary notice with the territorial office before Crow has time to move against it, she paused. It creates a record. An official record that exists before anyone has a chance to make it disappear. Can we get Birch to move that fast? I don't know, she said, but we could ask him directly. They rode to the sheriff's office the next morning, which was a Thursday, which was the day the blizzard started. It didn't announce itself as a blizzard at first. It announced itself as clouds, the particular dense gray-white clouds that came off the Bitterroot Range with a weight to them that people who'd wintered in the valley long enough recognized instinctively, the way an old dog recognized thunder before the sound arrived. Mara looked at them when they rode out and said nothing, but she urged her horse faster than she'd been riding. They made it to town. Birch was in his office, which was warm and smelled like bad coffee and pine resin from the wood stove, and he listened to what they had to say about Judge Farrow with an expression that went through 3 distinct changes before settling into something resolute and tired. I know about Farrow and Crow, he said. I've known for 2 years. Then why didn't you? Caleb started. Because knowing and being able to do something about it are different things, Birch said, which was nearly the same thing Mara had said to Caleb weeks ago. And Caleb had the uncomfortable experience of hearing his own situation reflected back at him from another angle. What I can do is what your wife is suggesting. I can file the preliminary notice today. I have the authority to do that without Farrow's involvement, and once it's in the territorial record, it can't be quietly made to not exist. Then do it, Caleb said. Birch looked at Mara. The documentation you prepared, he said. Is there a copy here, or... I brought it, she said, and took a folded set of papers from inside her coat. Birch took them with the look of a man reassessing something. You came prepared to do this today. I came prepared for whatever was necessary, she said. He filed the notice that afternoon. By the time he was done, the snow had been falling for 2 hours and the wind had shifted to come down hard from the northwest, which was the direction that meant it wasn't stopping anytime soon. They should have ridden back immediately. Caleb knew it, and Mara knew it, and they were halfway out of town before the visibility dropped to the point where he could see she was calculating the distance against the worsening conditions. He was doing the same calculation. The Decker farm is closer than the ranch, he said. We don't need to stop, she said, but her voice had the quality of someone saying a thing they're not entirely certain of. Mara. I've ridden in worse, she said. I know you have, he said. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying we don't need to. She looked at the road ahead, which was disappearing into white. And then she looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not capitulation, not quite, but a slight release of the stubbornness, which with Mara was as close to agreement as you usually got. Fine, she said. The Decker farm. They made it to the Decker farm in 40 minutes that should have taken 20, both of them riding with their heads down against the wind. Holt Decker, who was Porter's cousin and who thought Caleb was crazy in a mostly affectionate way, took their horses without comment and got them into the barn. His wife Ruth put them in front of her stove with hot coffee and the manner of a woman who had been managing unexpected guests in bad weather for 30 years and had made her peace with it. The storm kept them there for 2 days. It was, in its way, the most information Caleb had gotten about his wife in a single continuous stretch of time. Not because she was unusually forthcoming, she wasn't, but because being confined to someone else's house for 2 days with nothing to do meant conversation eventually happened, whether you planned it or not. Ruth Decker was the kind of warm, persistent woman who drew people out without seeming to try. And on the second evening, she and Mara sat at the kitchen table while the storm shook the house, and Mara talked. She talked about the territories, about moving from property to property with her father, who had been a man with a genuine gift for finding good land, and an equally genuine inability to hold on to it. About the seasons of real deprivation, not the romantic poverty of frontier stories, but the specific grinding difficulty of not having enough food in winter and knowing there was nothing coming until spring. About learning to track and hunt, because it was track and hunt or go hungry, and going hungry wasn't something she was willing to do if there was an alternative. Caleb sat across the room pretending to read one of the Decker family's 3 books, which he'd read before, and listened to his wife talk about herself in more consecutive sentences than he'd heard in 4 months. Ruth was watching Mara with the steady attention of a woman taking stock of someone. "You were alone out there a lot," she said, "as a girl." "My father worked long hours," Mara said. "He wasn't neglectful. He just wasn't always there. And you managed." "I learned to," Mara said. There was a flatness to it that wasn't self-pity and wasn't pride, just the simple statement of something that had been required of her and that she had done. "The managing was easier than the being looked at afterward," she added, which was the most honest thing Caleb had ever heard her say about herself. And he kept his eyes on the page. Ruth nodded slowly. "People don't know what to do with a woman who's done things they couldn't do themselves," she said. "No," Mara said. "They don't." The storm broke on the 3rd morning. They rode back to the ranch in the cold, clear aftermath of it, through a landscape that had been rearranged by the snow into something quieter and more absolute. The Bitterroot Range stood against the pale blue sky with the sharp specificity of things that have been scoured clean, and the valley below it was white and still. They arrived to a ranch that had survived the storm with the practical efficiency of a place whose hands knew what they were doing. Porter had kept the fires and the animals, Decker had reinforced the barn roof where it was showing strain, and Cole had shoveled a path from the house to the outbuildings that was narrow but passable. Everything was intact. Everything, that is, except the news that Porter gave them within 10 minutes of their return. "Crow's been talking," Porter said, "while you were gone." He told them what he'd heard from a neighboring properties hand who'd come by to check on things during the storm. Silas Crow had used the 2 days of the blizzard, when half the valley was sheltering in place, and people had nothing to do but talk, to circulate a story. The story was that Caleb Voss had falsified cattle records, that the missing animals had died from his own mismanagement of the winter herd, a mismanagement his new wife had supposedly encouraged by insisting on methods that didn't suit the local conditions, that the sheriff's filing was a desperate attempt to shift blame for his own failures onto an innocent neighbor. It was a good story. That was the part that made Caleb's jaw tighten when Porter finished telling it, not the lie itself, but how well constructed it was. It took the facts and rearranged them with the skill of someone who'd thought carefully about what an audience would want to believe, and the audience in Red Hollow had already been primed. Caleb had rejected their daughters. He had married a woman they'd decided was strange and unwanted. They wanted him to be wrong about her. Silas Crow had given them a version of events that let them be right. "How much has it spread?" Mara asked. "All of it," Porter said. "The whole valley." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where was Reeves during the storm?" Porter frowned. "Crow's man? I don't know." "Find out," she said. It took 2 days to find out, but what they found mattered. Reeves had spent the blizzard at the saloon, which was not unusual. Half the men in the valley had done the same. But Reeves had also made a point of visiting the telegraph office the morning before the storm hit, which the telegraph operator, a meticulous man named Houston, who kept detailed logs as a professional habit, had noted in his records. The message Reeves had sent was not in the log. Operators recorded sends but not content, but the timing of it was. The morning before the blizzard. The same morning Caleb and Mara had ridden to the sheriff's office. "He knew we were going to Birch," Mara said, looking at the information Caleb had brought back from town. "Someone told him." "Or he had someone watching the road," Caleb said. Either way, the message he sent, wherever it went, was sent before Birch filed the notice. She looked up, which means whoever received it had time to prepare before the official record existed. "Prepare how?" "I don't know yet," she said. She found out 4 days later. The letter arrived from Billings, from Silas Crow's lawyer, a man named Calder, who had a reputation in the territorial courts for being both expensive and effective. The letter was addressed to Sheriff Birch and cited 3 affidavits from unnamed parties that claimed to have direct knowledge of Caleb Voss's cattle management practices, all of them supporting the account Silas had circulated during the storm. Birch sent Caleb a copy with a note that said, in Birch's spare handwriting, "This is a problem. Come see me." Caleb went. Mara went with him. Birch was at his desk with the letter in front of him and the look of a man who'd slept badly. 3 affidavits is not nothing, Birch said. Even if we both know they're manufactured, a territorial judge looking at competing evidence, your documentation versus 3 sworn statements, has grounds to delay any action indefinitely. Who are the unnamed parties? Mara said. Unnamed in the letter. I can try to find out, but Calder will resist disclosure. He'll have to disclose in a formal proceeding, she said. In a formal proceeding, yes, but getting to a formal proceeding takes time and money. Which is the point, Mara said. Make it expensive and slow, and most people give up. Yes, Birch said. Mara looked at Caleb. He read the look. Not a request for permission, but a check, the way you checked a partner's position before making a move that affected both of you. He gave her a slight nod. There's a passage, she said to Birch, above the Bitterroot tree line, northeast of the second ridge. Most people in this valley don't know it exists. I found it 4 years ago when I was tracking water movement through the upper terrain. She paused. It connects to logging roads on the other side that come out near the Crow property's northern boundary. Birch looked at her carefully. Why are you telling me this? Because if cattle were moved in volume, not 3 or 4 at a time through a cut fence, but a real number, enough to have been accumulated over several months, that passage is the only route where you could do it without risk of being seen. She put her hands flat on the desk. And because the passage isn't on any surveyed map of this valley, which means Silas Crow either knows about it or he doesn't. If he does, his operation is more organized than what you're looking for. If he doesn't, you'll find the evidence you need on the other side of that ridge before he has any reason to move it. The room was quiet for a long moment. You'd have to guide us, Birch said. I don't have a man who knows that terrain. I know that, she said. It's February, he said. That's a hard ride in February. I know that too, she said. Caleb said, I'll go with her. No, she said immediately, not looking at him. Mara, you need to be here, she said. If Crow moves against the ranch while the sheriff is gone with me, there needs to be someone here with standing to respond. She looked at Birch. You'd need 2 deputies and a fast horse. I'd need 1 deputy who can follow a trail without asking questions every 10 minutes. Birch almost smiled. I've got one of those. Then we leave day after tomorrow, she said. The weather window is 4 to 5 days before the next system comes in. That's enough time if we don't waste it. Caleb walked with Mara back to their horses. The main street of Red Hollow was quieter than usual in the cold, the kind of quiet that settled on a place after a storm when everyone was still digging out and the ordinary business of life hadn't fully resumed. 2 women crossed the street ahead of them and didn't look up, which told Caleb they'd seen who was coming and decided not to make eye contact, which itself told him healthing in the days since the blizzard. You don't have to do this alone, he said quietly when they reached the horses. I'm not doing it alone, she said. I'm doing it with a deputy who won't ask questions. She untied her horse. You can't come because I'm right about why you need to stay, and you know I'm right. That doesn't make it easier. She paused with her hand on the saddle and looked at him. It was the look he'd learned over these months, the one where she was deciding whether something was worth saying out loud versus keeping it in the place inside herself where she kept most things. I've been in worse situations than this, she said, alone, with less preparation and less at stake. She mounted. This is not that. He believed her. That was the thing. He genuinely believed her, not because he needed to in order to feel better, but because he knew by now that Mara Whitlock did not say things she didn't mean. She wasn't reassuring him. She was stating a fact. She and Birch's deputy, a solidly built man named Trace, who had the economy of movement of someone who'd spent years outdoors and knew how to conserve energy over long distances, left 2 mornings later before dawn. Caleb stood in the yard and watched them go, which was one of the harder things he'd done in recent memory. Not because he doubted her, but because standing still when someone you'd come to rely on rode into difficult country was its own particular kind of hard. He went back inside and ran the ranch. They were gone for 3 days. During those 3 days, Caleb received 2 visits that he hadn't expected, and one that he had. The one he'd expected was Silas Crow, who arrived on the second afternoon with Reeves at his back, and the particular ease of a man who had decided that the moment had arrived to be directly unpleasant. He stopped his horse at the fence line, the same fence line he'd walked through before, but this time he didn't come through the gate. He stayed on the road, which was a choice that meant something, though Caleb wasn't certain yet what. "I hear your wife's taken a ride up into the hills," Silas said. "She has," Caleb said, from the porch. He hadn't moved toward the gate. "Rough country for a woman alone." "She has company," Silas smiled. It was the smile of a man who understood he was being told something without being told it directly. "I imagine Birch's man is good in a fight," he said. "Less sure he's good in a blizzard." "There's no blizzard," Caleb said. "The weather's clear." "For now," Silas said. He let that sit for a moment, the way a man lets a remark sit when he wants you to hear both the surface and what's under it. Then, "You've gone to a lot of trouble, Caleb, for a situation that could be resolved simply. What would you consider a simple resolution?" "A conversation," Silas said, "about the land, about what a reasonable man in your position might decide to do, given how his circumstances have developed." "My circumstances are fine," Caleb said. "The feed store credit disagrees." "The feed store credit is one man's business decision," Caleb said. "I've got 4 other options for spring feed." He didn't entirely. But Silas didn't need to know the detail of it. Silas looked at him for a long moment. The ease was still there in his posture, but something behind it had gone a degree colder. "Your wife is going to come back from wherever she's gone," he said, "and nothing will be different. You'll still have a legal fight that will run 2 years and cost more than it's worth. You'll still have a valley full of people who think you married badly and are too proud to admit it, and you'll still have me as a neighbor, which I can make comfortable or uncomfortable depending on how this goes." He gathered his reins. "Think about it." He rode away. Caleb went inside and sat at the kitchen table and did not think about the offer, because the offer was not something he was going to accept, and thinking about it was therefore not useful. Instead, he thought about the 2 unexpected visits. The first had been from Ruth Decker, who had come by on the first morning after Mara left, ostensibly to return a pot she'd borrowed before the storm, but actually, Caleb understood, to check on things. She'd sat down without being asked and talked for an hour, partly about ordinary things, and partly about Mara, specifically about the conversation they'd had during the blizzard. "He doesn't know how to let people think well of her," Ruth said. "She's had enough experience of them thinking badly that she doesn't quite believe the other thing is possible." "She doesn't ask for anyone's opinion," Caleb said. "No," Ruth said, "but she notices. She notices more than she lets on." She stood up to leave and then turned at the door. "What she did, going with Birch's man up into that country, half the men in this valley wouldn't do it. The other half would need convincing. She didn't need convincing." "No," he said. She didn't. The second unexpected visit was from Daniel Hargrove. That one came on the 3rd afternoon, the day before Mara was due back. Hargrove rode up alone, which was unusual for a man who tended to move with the social weight of his family standing around him at all times. He was in his mid-50s, broad-faced and weathered, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who was doing something he'd decided to do before he'd fully figured out how to do it. "I heard what Crow's been saying," Hargrove said, "about the cattle records." "Most of the valley has," Caleb said. "I want you to know I don't believe it." Caleb looked at him. "You spent most of the fall telling people I'd made a mistake," he said. "I know." "You called me simple." "I know that too." Hargrove's jaw moved slightly, the physical manifestation of a proud man swallowing something difficult. "I was wrong about the woman. I don't know her well enough to have said the things I said about her. That was—" He paused. "That was wrong of me." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind?" "Crow came to me last week," Hargrove said. "Wanted me to add my name to a statement about your cattle management. Told me it was in everyone's interest to support the account he was putting out." He put his hat back on. "A man who tries to use me to destroy a neighbor doesn't get my cooperation, regardless of what I think about the neighbor's domestic arrangements." He turned to go. "If you need witnesses to your character when this goes to the courts, come find me." He left. Caleb stood on the porch for a minute after Hargrove's horse disappeared down the road. The afternoon was cold and very clear, the sky the deep blue that only came after extended cold, and the Bitterroot Range was bright white against it. Somewhere up there, in the terrain above the tree line, Mara was doing the things she'd said she was capable of doing. She came back on the 4th day, not the 3rd. The delay cost Caleb a night of poor sleep and a morning of sustained effort not to show it to the hands, who were already watching for signs of how things stood. She and Trace rode in just before noon, both horses tired, both riders carrying the physical weight of days outdoors in hard country. Trace's face, when he dismounted, was the face of a man who had seen something he was still processing. Mara dismounted and led her horse toward the barn without ceremony, which was so typical of her that it was almost funny, and Caleb fell in beside her. "You're a day late," he said. "Weather on the second night," she said. "We sheltered until it passed." "Did you find anything?" She handed the horse off to Cole, who appeared without being asked, and turned to face Caleb. She was cold and tired, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't triumph. It was more complex than triumph, the expression of someone who had confirmed a thing they needed to confirm and now had to figure out what to do with the confirmation. "There's a holding area on the other side of the pass," she said. "Natural terrain feature, a bowl in the rock, partially covered. Someone built a temporary enclosure in it, post and rail, maybe 40 feet across. The rails are still there. Hoof prints everywhere, old and new, and below the enclosure, the logging road heading northeast. How many head would that hold? 30, maybe 40, rotated through over several months." She met his eyes. "Caleb, we found 3 animals still there. Your brand." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it, the quiet of a thing becoming certain that had previously been only probable. 3 animals. His brand. In an enclosure on the far side of a pass that only Mara knew about, on a route that led directly toward Crow's northern boundary. "Trace documented it," he said. "Everything," she said. "Official record. He filed it with Birch by telegraph from the station on the eastern logging road before we started back." The relief was physical. He felt it in his shoulders, felt some held tension release that he hadn't entirely registered as tension until it let go. He reached out and put his hand briefly on her arm, which was the most demonstrative thing he'd done since the morning he asked her to marry him, and she looked at his hand and then at him with an expression that was surprised, and then wasn't. "It doesn't end this," she said. "Crow's lawyer will still fight it." "I know," he said, "and the town will need time to—" "Mara," he said. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The tiredness was still there, and the cold, and underneath it both, that permanent watchfulness that was so much a part of her that he'd stopped noticing it as a separate thing. She nodded, once, the way she acknowledged things that mattered without making a ceremony of them. Then she went inside to get warm. Trace gave his full report to Birch the following morning. With the documentation and the photographs taken with the camera, Birch had apparently thought to send along, which spoke to Birch's quiet thoroughness in a way that Caleb added to his assessment of the man. The 3 cattle were confirmed as Voss stock by brand record. The enclosure showed evidence of extended use. The logging road leading to Crow's northern property line was documented by mileage and terrain description. It was enough. Not enough to end it. Mara had been right about that, and Caleb's own knowledge of how legal proceedings worked in the territory was sufficient to confirm it. Crow's lawyer would file responses and delays and competing affidavits, and it would run through the courts for longer than anyone wanted. But it was enough to make the territorial proceedings real, enough to take the thing out of the realm of one man's word against another's and put it into the realm of documented fact, which was, as Mara had understood from the beginning, the only ground that mattered. What neither of them had fully anticipated was the effect on the town. Red Hollow was a small valley, and small valleys had their own mechanisms for distributing information, and the information that Birch's deputy had ridden up into the high country with Caleb Voss's wife and come back with documented evidence of cattle theft had circulated through those mechanisms with impressive speed. By the end of the week, the version of events that Silas Crow had so carefully constructed during the blizzard had developed cracks in it. Some people ignored the cracks. Some people had too much invested in their original position to revise it. But some people, and among them, Caleb noticed, several who had been loudest in their first judgment of Mara, went quiet in the particular way of people reconsidering. It was not an apology. It was not an embrace. It was simply a shift in the prevailing temperature of the valley's opinion, from cold to something less than cold, which was its own kind of statement. Mara noticed. Caleb could see that she noticed, but she moved through it the same way she moved through everything, without adjusting her behavior to it, without leaning toward the warmth, without giving any sign that it was changing the internal landscape of how she carried herself. She had learned, at some point in those years before Red Hollow, before the territories, Before the aunt in Pennsylvania who didn't have patience for useless things, she had learned to want very little from the opinion of people who hadn't earned the right to matter. It was a protection. He understood that. But he also understood in the way you understood things about a person after months of close daily proximity that it was also a habit that had outlasted some of its usefulness. He didn't say that to her. It wasn't the right time, and with Mara, timing was most of everything. Instead, he watched her walk the fence line on a clear February afternoon, testing the post she hadn't yet gotten to, working her way methodically down the eastern perimeter while the cold settled around her without seeming to touch her. In any way she acknowledged. She stopped at the second post from the corner, knelt, pressed her thumb against the base where wood met frozen ground, and then stood and made a notation on the small paper she was carrying. She looked up and saw him watching from the yard. "This one needs to be done before spring," she called across. "Add it to the list," he said. She made the notation and moved to the next post, and the Bitterroot Range stood behind her in the pale winter light, enormous and indifferent and completely unconcerned with the smallness of the people moving at its feet. And Caleb thought that if you were going to be small in the face of something that large and indifferent, there were worse things to be than stubborn and accurate and standing upright in the cold. The spring thaw came in stages, the way it always did in the valley. Tentative at first, a few degrees of warmth that retreated by evening, then a harder commitment in mid-March that turned the roads to mud and made the creek run fast and brown with snowmelt. The Voss Ranch came through the winter in better shape than Caleb had expected, which was partly luck and partly the diversion channel that had protected the field drainage exactly as Mara had predicted it would. The south crop bed was intact. The cattle count, what remained of it, was healthy. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But the ranch was standing, and that was more than some people in the valley could say. Silas Crow's lawyer had filed 2 responses to the territorial proceedings by the end of February. Both were what Birch had predicted: delays, technical objections, a challenge to the admissibility of Trace's field documentation on procedural grounds that Caleb's own lawyer, a careful man named Whitfield who worked out of the county seat, described as weak but time-consuming. The legal process had its own rhythm, slow and grinding, and there was very little any of them could do but maintain their documentation and wait for it to move. What nobody had fully predicted was Reeves. The thin-faced man who had worked for Silas Crow for 2 years disappeared from Red Hollow on a Tuesday in late March, quietly and without apparent notice, and was simply not there when people looked for him the following week. His rented room at the boarding house was cleaned out. His horse was gone. He told no one he was leaving and left no forwarding information with anyone in town. Mara heard about it from Ruth Decker, who heard it from the boarding house owner, who heard it from the telegraph operator Houston, and she came back from Ruth's with a look on her face that she carried into the kitchen and sat with for a full 10 minutes before she said anything. "Reeves is gone," she told Caleb when he came in from the barn. He'd already heard. Porter had mentioned it at midday. "What do you make of it?" "Either Crow cut him loose to reduce his own exposure," she said, "or Reeves made a decision that working for a man who's now under territorial investigation was not a safe long-term position." She turned her coffee cup in both hands. "Either way, it means Crow's legal strategy isn't working as well as he thought it would, or he's clearing the ground for something else." "Clearing the ground how?" "I don't know yet," she said. That particular not knowing had a different quality than Mara's usual patience with incomplete information. She wasn't comfortable with it. He could see that in the slight tension around her eyes, the way she looked at the map on the work table without actually studying it, which was what she did when she was thinking about something she didn't have enough pieces for yet. He found out what the pieces were for 10 days later, when Whitfield rode up from the county seat with papers and an expression that said he'd ridden fast and the papers explained why. Crow had filed a land claim. Not against the Voss Ranch directly. That would have been too obvious, too easily challenged. He'd filed against a 60-acre parcel on the northern boundary of Caleb's property, claiming an old survey discrepancy that he said placed that section outside the boundaries of the original Voss land grant. The claim cited a survey conducted in 1871, before Caleb's father had purchased the land, that allegedly showed the boundary running 30 yards further south than the current markers indicated. "It's a manufactured claim," Whitfield said, sitting at the kitchen table with the papers spread in front of him. "The 1871 survey he's citing doesn't match any record in the county office. But he's not trying to win it cleanly. He's trying to create a competing legal question that ties up your entire northern boundary in dispute while the cattle theft proceedings are running, which means we can't sell, can't develop, can't use that section for anything, Caleb said. And any buyer who looked at the ranch would see a legal cloud and walk away. That's correct, Whitfield said. Mara was looking at the claim documents with the careful attention she gave to things that required careful attention. She read in silence for 2 minutes while the men waited. Then she set the paper down and tapped the survey date with one finger. The 1871 survey, she said. Who conducted it? A man named Aldrich, Whitfield said, territorial surveyor at the time. Is there an original document filed with the territorial office? Crow's lawyer is claiming it was a private survey, not filed with the territory. That it was conducted for the previous landowner before the sale. Then how does he have it? Whitfield paused. He claims to have purchased it as part of an estate acquisition. Previous owner died without heirs, estate was liquidated. Mara looked at Caleb. He read the look. You think it doesn't exist, he said. I think a private survey from 1871 that was never filed with the territory, that's now being produced by a man with a documented interest in acquiring your land, needs to be seen in its original form before anyone treats it as evidence of anything, she said. She looked back at Whitfield. Can you demand production of the original document? Yes, Whitfield said slowly. It would take some time, but yes. How long? 6 weeks? Maybe 8. Then do it, she said. And when you file that demand, make sure it goes to the territorial court directly, not through the county level. Whitfield looked at her with the expression Caleb had seen on several men's faces over the past months. A reassessment happening in real time. The recalibration of someone who had expected to be in a room with a rancher and his quiet wife, and had found himself in a room with 2 people who both had views worth listening to. That's the correct strategy, Whitfield said, to both of them, but slightly more in her direction. Yes. The demand for document production was filed within the week. And then, as legal proceedings in the territory tended to do, everything slowed to the pace of institutional machinery that had no awareness of urgency and no interest in acquiring one. April came. The mud dried. The first crop planting went into the south field 2 weeks later than Caleb had wanted, but earlier than he'd feared, and the field drainage held, and the plants that came up in early May had the steady, unspectacular health of things growing in well-managed soil. Mara had been right about the crop bed. She had been right about several things, in the accumulated record of the winter and spring, and the ranch was carrying that rightness in its soil and its fence lines and its water management in ways that wouldn't show in any dramatic fashion, but would show, by summer's end, in the numbers. The hands had settled into a particular relationship with her that Caleb watched develop with something he couldn't quite call amusement. It was more precise than that. Porter had accepted her from early on, with the uncomplicated pragmatism of someone who judged people by whether they made his job easier or harder. Decker had come around after the Channel Slope incident, quietly and completely. Cole was slower, more guarded, but by April he was asking her questions about the Southfield drainage with the straightforward curiosity of someone who had decided the source of the information didn't matter as much as the information itself. The one who surprised Caleb most was young Pete, the extra hand he'd hired for the diversion channel work and then kept on through winter. Pete was 19 and had come to the valley from somewhere east with very little experience and very clear ideas about how things ought to work, some of which were useful and some of which were not. He'd been careful around Mara in the early months, not unfriendly, but with the carefulness of someone navigating a social situation he didn't have a map for. Then in April, he'd come to her with a problem about a sick animal he'd been trying to handle alone and making worse, and she'd helped him fix it without making anything of the fact that he'd waited too long to ask. And after that, his carefulness had gone, and something simpler had replaced it. He started talking to her the way he talked to the other hands, directly, without the layer of uncertainty underneath it. None of this was dramatic. None of it was the stuff of a story anyone would tell later. It was just the slow accumulation of ordinary days in which Mara's presence on the ranch shifted from strange to familiar, the way most things shifted if you gave them enough uninterrupted time. What interrupted it was Silas Crow's move in May. He had been quiet since the land claim filing. Too quiet, by Caleb's reckoning, for a man whose legal strategy was being methodically challenged and whose main operative had left the valley without explanation. The quiet had the quality of preparation, and Caleb had been waiting for what it was preparation for. And on a Wednesday morning in the second week of May, he found out. Silas called a valley meeting, not through the town council, which was the usual mechanism for valley-wide gatherings. He went around it, sent personal messages to the 12 largest landholders in Red Hollow, including Hargrove and Bellamy and Kent and the others, and he framed the meeting as a discussion of water rights in the upcoming summer season, which was a legitimate and perennial concern for any ranching valley, and which gave people a reason to come that didn't look like taking sides. Porter brought Caleb the news that the meeting had been called, and who had been invited and who had not. Caleb had not been invited? He told Mara at supper. She listened and ate and didn't say anything for a while. Then, "When is it?" "Friday evening, the Bellamy house." "Are you going?" "I wasn't invited." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "If I show up uninvited, I look like a man who's panicking, like I'm afraid of what they'll decide without me." "You are afraid of what they'll decide without you." "Yes," he said, "but there's a difference between feeling it and showing it." She was quiet again. "I should go," she said. He put down his fork. "You weren't invited either." "No," she said, "but half those families have daughters I've never spoken to, neighbors I've never addressed directly, people who know me only as what the town has made of me." She looked at the table. "If I walk into that room, I'm no longer the story they've been telling about me. I'm a person in a room. They might not let you in." "They might not," she said, "but Hargrove will. He told you to come find him if you needed witnesses to your character. That's a man who's positioned himself to be seen as reasonable and fair. He won't turn away a woman at the door in front of his peers." Caleb thought about it. She was probably right about Hargrove. She was usually right about people when she'd had enough time to observe them, which was one of the things that came from years of watching a social structure from the outside. You learn to read the individual parts of it more clearly than people who were inside it. "You'd be walking into a room that spent 6 months thinking badly of you," he said. "I've been walking into rooms like that my whole life," she said. I didn't have an answer for that. She went alone on Friday evening. Caleb had offered twice more to come, and twice more she'd declined, and he'd respected it, though the evening was the longest he could remember spending at the ranch without anything specific to do. He went through the supply ledger. He checked the south field twice, which didn't need checking. He sat on the porch for an hour in the cooling dark and listened to the creek, which was running quieter now as the snowmelt settled into its summer rhythm. She came back at 9:30 with her coat dusty from the ride and her expression unreadable in the particular way that meant she was still organizing what had happened into a form she could present. He waited. She sat down on the porch steps, which was unusual. Mara didn't sit on steps. She sat at tables, in chairs, in places designed for sitting. The informality of it told him something before she said anything. "Hargrove let me in," she said. "I thought he would." Bellamy tried to object. Hargrove talked over him. She pulled her coat straighter. "Silas was already there. He saw me come in and he didn't say anything, which told me he wasn't sure how to play it with an audience watching." "What was the meeting actually about?" "Water rights was real," she said. "There's a genuine dispute about the summer allocation from the main creek, and 3 families are in conflict about it. Silas had offered himself as a mediator, which is why he called the meeting." She paused. "It was a smart move. It put him in the position of the reasonable man solving community problems, which was exactly the image he needed after the cattle investigation started. But I had Hargrove and Ruth Decker's husband and 2 others who know the water dispute better than Silas does, and I've mapped that creek in more detail than anyone in that room." She looked out at the dark. "I didn't try to make it about us. I just talked about the water." "What did you say?" She told him. She had walked into that room, and she had not addressed the months of gossip, or the land claim, or the cattle theft, or any of it. She had sat in the chair Hargrove had indicated for her, at the table, not against the wall, which was Hargrove's quiet statement to the room. And when the water discussion began, she had pulled from her coat a section of her hand-drawn map covering the creek's main channel and its tributary patterns, and she had laid it on the table and said calmly that she thought she might be able to help clarify some of the allocation questions. The room had been very still for about 15 seconds. Then Bellamy's eldest son, who managed his family's water intake, had leaned forward and looked at the map and asked where she'd gotten it, and she'd said she'd made it, and he'd asked when, and she'd said over 4 years of tracking the seasonal movement, and he'd been quiet for a moment and then asked if he could see the tributary markings for the eastern branch. She'd shown him. The meeting had run 2 more hours, and by the end of it, the water allocation dispute had moved closer to resolution than it had in 3 years of contention, because Mara had documented information about the creek's behavior that none of them had, and that made the disagreements make sense in a way they hadn't before. Silas had said very little after the first half hour. He had come to the meeting as the man with the answers, and the answers had arrived with someone else, and the room had quietly reorganized itself around the new information source, and there was nothing Silas could do about it without looking like a man who objected to the valley's water problems being solved. "He's not going to forgive you for that," Caleb said when she finished. "No," she said, "he isn't. It'll make him push harder on the land claim." "He was going to push hard regardless," she said. "At least now some of those families have sat in a room with me and had a conversation that wasn't about what they'd decided I was." She looked at her hands. "Bellamy's son shook my hand when he left." Caleb looked at her profile in the dark. The thing Ruth Decker had said in February, "She doesn't know how to let people think well of her," was in his mind. But watching her sit on the porch steps with her coat dusty and her voice carrying the flatness of someone who had just spent 2 hours managing herself in a difficult room, he understood that what looked like not knowing was actually something more complicated. She knew how to let people think well of her. She just didn't know how to trust that it would hold. "You did well tonight," he said. She didn't answer immediately. Then, "I talked about water." "I know what you did," he said. "I'm telling you it mattered." She looked at him for a moment. In the dark, her expression had that openness that happened sometimes when she was tired enough that the watchfulness partially dropped. "Hargrove wants to meet," she said, "to talk about the land claim survey. He says he knows people in the Territorial Records Office." "Good," Caleb said. "He also wants to bring in Bellamy Sr. to make it a formal discussion among the valley's larger landholders." "That's more than good," Caleb said. "That's Silas's ground shifting under him." The meeting with Hargrove happened 4 days later at the Hargrove house, which was the first time Caleb and Mara had been received socially by any family in Red Hollow. It had the slight awkwardness of all first times, the awareness of what hadn't happened in the months before, the careful avoidance of the subject of the daughters and the rejection and everything that had followed, but Hargrove moved through it with the practical efficiency of a man who had decided that what happened next was more important than what had already happened, and his wife set out coffee and food without ceremony and talked to Mara about the creek map with genuine curiosity, which cut the awkwardness faster than any formal acknowledgement could have. Bellamy Sr. came with his son. Kent came alone. Hargrove had also invited an older man named Gareth Pruitt, who had been in the valley since before most of them and who had a reputation for territorial legal knowledge built on 40 years of dealing with the bureaucratic machinery that governed land and water in the region. Pruitt looked at the land claim document for about 3 minutes and then put it down on the table with the expression of someone who'd been handed a counterfeit and recognized it immediately. "The 1871 Aldrich surveys," he said. "I know these. All of them. I was working with the county at the time. Aldrich did 12 surveys that year. All of them filed with the territorial office. Private surveys conducted by territorial surveyors were legally required to be filed. That's not a loophole, it's a mandate. If this document was not filed, it wasn't legal. And if it wasn't legal in 1871, it can't be produced as legal evidence now." The room was quiet. "Can you testify to that?" Whitfield asked. He had come with Caleb, his presence a sign that this had moved beyond a social call into something more structured. "In writing and in person," Pruitt said. "I kept my own records. I have correspondence from that survey season that lists all 12 Aldrich surveys by parcel and location. The Voss land parcel is not among them." Whitfield was already making notes. Mara was watching Pruitt with an expression of complete stillness that Caleb recognized as what happened when she got information she'd been looking for. "He manufactured it," Bellamy Sr. said quietly. It was not a question. "He produced a document that doesn't exist in any official record and claimed it as evidence," Pruitt said. "What you call that is your business." Hargrove looked at Caleb. "We've all done business with Silas Crow at some point," he said. Some of us more than others. This, he gestured at the document, this changes things. It should have changed things when he started circulating lies about my cattle management, Caleb said, with a flatness that was not quite accusation, but was not entirely free of it either. The silence that followed had the quality of a room of men acknowledging something they would rather not acknowledge. Hargrove took it without deflecting. "You're right," he said. "I'm not going to argue that." It was the second time Hargrove had said something honest and difficult to Caleb in recent months, and Caleb gave it the same reception both times. He acknowledged it and moved forward, because backward was not a useful direction. "What I need," Caleb said, "is for this group to put their names on a formal statement to the territorial court attesting to the procedural requirements of the 1871 survey season, corroborating what Pruitt knows. The more voices on that statement, the harder it is for Crow's lawyer to challenge it." "I'll sign it," Hargrove said immediately. Bellamy Sr. looked at his son. His son nodded. "We'll sign it," Bellamy said. Kent signed without being asked again. Pruitt had never been unwilling. They walked out of the Hargrove house into a May afternoon that was warm for the first time since October, and Mara was quiet for most of the ride home, but it was a different quality of quiet than usual. Not the quiet of someone managing a difficult internal landscape, the quieter quiet of someone who had arrived somewhere and was taking a moment to register it. Halfway back to the ranch, she said, "Pruitt knew immediately." "He did," Caleb said, "which means Crow knew the document wouldn't survive serious scrutiny." "Yes." "So he was counting on it not getting serious scrutiny," she said. "He was counting on the weight of a legal filing being enough to create the cloud he needed without anyone going back to check the source." "He was counting on no one knowing enough to check," Caleb said, "or caring enough." "Pruitt is 80 years old," she said. "If he'd died 2 years ago or moved away or just not been at that table." "He wasn't," Caleb said. "He was there." She was quiet again. Then, "Things work out sometimes by accident." "Sometimes," he said, "and sometimes by showing up at meetings you weren't invited to with a map you made yourself." She looked at him sidelong, and there was something in her expression he didn't see often enough. Not quite a smile, but the thing that preceded one when she let it get that far. "The map was useful," she said. "It was," he agreed. The territorial court received Whitfield's filing with Pruitt's affidavit and the corroborating statement from Hargrove, Bellamy, Kent, and 2 other Valley landholders by the end of May. Crow's lawyer asked for a 60-day extension to respond, which was granted as a matter of routine, which meant the summer would run with the legal process in its background hum without resolution. What changed was the foreground. The Valley meeting, the Hargrove house, the signed statement. These things moved through Red Hollow's information channels the same way everything moved through them, faster than telegraph and less accurate. And what emerged on the other side was a version of events that was not entirely true and not entirely false. The version was this. Caleb Voss's wife had come to the water meeting with maps nobody else had. She'd helped solve something that had been stuck for 3 years. And the survey Silas Crow was using to try to take the Voss land was apparently not real, which several of the Valley's more respected men had put their names to in writing. None of this rehabilitated Mara in any complete sense. Rehabilitation required an admission of original error, and most people in Red Hollow were not built for that kind of clean accounting of their own behavior. What happened instead was something more typical, and in its way more durable. They simply began treating her differently without ever acknowledging that they had treated her badly before. She noticed it in small ways. The clerk at the general store began filling her orders without the small hesitations that had been his version of the town's disapproval. 2 women who had been conspicuously not looking at her for 6 months began making eye contact. Clara Price, the daughter who had talked knowledgeably about soil at her father's freezing outdoor picnic, stopped Mara on the street one afternoon and asked about the creek map, and they stood in front of the dry goods store for 20 minutes, talking about drainage, and Mara came home with more color in her face than Caleb had seen in months. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't want to name it and have the naming make her self-conscious about it. He just watched. What he was also watching, at a distance, was Silas Crow. A man like Silas didn't retreat. He hadn't built what he'd built by retreating when things didn't go his way. He reassessed. He looked at the board and found what piece was still available to him, and he moved it. The legal strategy was losing ground. The social strategy broke the narrative he'd built during the blizzard about Caleb's failures had been eroded by the water meeting and the Hargrove statement. His operative was gone. What he had left was time and money, and the particular patience of a man who had played a long game before and knew that a long game didn't end until someone left the table. Caleb knew Silas wasn't finished. He said so to Mara on a June evening when they were both tired from a long day, and the quality of their tiredness had the ease of two people who have worked hard at the same thing and are resting from it together. "I know," she said. "He's going to come at something we haven't anticipated," Caleb said. "That's his pattern." "Yes," she said. She was quiet for a moment. "There's one thing he hasn't touched." "What's that?" She looked at him with that direct, weighing look, the one she'd given him at her door on the very first day, the look that was trying to figure out whether something was worth the trouble of saying. "My past," she said. "The territories. The years I was gone. He hasn't used any of it." Caleb waited. "I don't know how much he knows," she said. "I don't know how much there is to find. But there are things from those years that—" She stopped, started again. "I wasn't always careful. I was young and things happened and I made decisions that made sense at the time." "What kind of decisions?" "Nothing illegal," she said quickly. "Nothing that hurt anyone, but the kind of decisions that look a certain way if someone chooses to frame them badly." She looked at her hands. "A dispute over a claim in the territories. A man who accused my father of something he didn't do. I testified in that proceeding. The man had connections, and the outcome was, it wasn't just." "Was there a record?" "Territorial court record, yes," she said. "It's old. Most people wouldn't know where to look, but someone with enough money and the right lawyer—" "Calder," Caleb said. "Calder," she agreed. He sat with this for a moment. Outside the window, the evening was doing what June evenings did in the valley, going golden and then slow, the light pulling back from the fields in stages like someone taking their time leaving a place they liked. The creek was a thread of sound beneath the quiet. "Tell me what's in that record," he said. "Everything. I'm not asking to judge it. I'm asking so I know what we're dealing with if it comes." She looked at him for a long moment. The watchfulness was there. It was always there. But underneath it was something he'd seen more of lately, carefully and in small increments, which was the thing that happened when a person began to believe that a place might be safe enough to be honest in. She told him. It took the better part of an hour, and when she was done, Caleb sat with it and found that his assessment of her had not changed in any fundamental direction. The territory dispute was old, and the injustice in it was on the side of the people accusing her family, not the other way around. And the decisions she was worried about looked, from where he sat, like the decisions of a 16-year-old trying to protect a dying father with the limited tools available to her. "He could use it to muddy the water," Caleb said. "Make it about your character instead of about his crimes." "Yes," she said. "Then we get ahead of it," he said. "We tell Hargrove and Whitfield. Not everything, what's legally relevant. So if Calder produces anything from that record, there are already people who know the context." She was quiet. "Mara," he said. "I know," she said. "You're right. I know." She said it the way she said things that cost her something, flatly, cleanly, without drama. "I'm not used to having people to tell things to." He looked at her. The golden light was mostly gone now, and the kitchen was in the comfortable dimness that came before you lit the lamps, and she was sitting across the table with her hands flat on its surface and the expression of someone who had said something true and was waiting to see what happened to it. "You have them now," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her hands. "I'll talk to Hargrove," she said. "Tomorrow." He got up and lit the lamp, and the kitchen came into the warm, ordinary light of an evening that was not resolved and was not finished, and had in it the particular quality of a thing that was still being built, imperfect and ongoing and more solid than it looked from the outside, the way the best things usually were. Mara talked to Hargrove on a Thursday morning in the first week of July. She rode over alone, which was her preference for anything that required her to say difficult things. An audience of one was easier to manage than an audience of two, even when the second person was on her side. Caleb watched her go from the porch and then went back to the work of the day, which was what you did when you had learned that the person you were married to was more capable than your instinct to protect her. She was back by noon. She unsaddled her horse, turned it into the paddock, and came to where Caleb was working on the equipment shed door, which had been warping for 2 seasons and had finally reached the point where it required real attention. "How did it go?" he said. He already knew about the territory dispute, she said. Not the details, but he'd heard there was something in my past from Bellamy, who heard it from someone. He didn't know who. She leaned against the shed wall. He said he was glad I'd come to him directly, that it was the right thing to do. Did he seem... He wasn't troubled by it, she said, with the slight relief of someone reporting a thing they'd been uncertain about. He said what you said, that if Calder tries to use it, having people who know the context is the defense. She looked at the paddock. He's going to tell Whitfield today, and he said... She paused. He said that Silas Crow had done something to every family in this valley at some point, that he'd been patient because Silas was powerful, not because they trusted him, and that this had gone on long enough. Caleb set down the plane he was using on the door frame. "What does that mean practically?" "It means Hargrove is going to call another meeting," she said. "A real one, through the town council this time, and he wants us there." The meeting happened 10 days later. It was the first full valley meeting. All major landholders, council members, Birch, 2 men from the county commissioner's office who had ridden out specifically for it, that Red Hollow had held in 3 years. Silas Crow received the same notification as everyone else. He came, which surprised some people and didn't surprise Caleb at all. A man who didn't show up to a meeting about his own affairs was a man who had already lost. The room was the largest in the valley, the community hall that the town had built in its optimistic early years, and that got used for weddings and disputes and the occasional dance and not much else. Caleb and Mara arrived together and sat at the table Hargrove had indicated, which was near the front, which was another of Hargrove's quiet statements. Silas sat on the opposite side with his jaw set and the contained stillness of a man keeping his reactions below the surface. Whitfield presented first. He had distilled the months of legal proceedings into a clear, sequential account: the missing cattle, the cut fence, the documented evidence from Trace and Birch, the 3 Voss animals found in the holding enclosure on the other side of the mountain pass. He presented Pruitt's affidavit about the 1871 survey requirements and the physical impossibility of the document Crow had produced as evidence. He presented the corroborating statements from Hargrove, Bellamy, Kent, and the others. He was careful, precise, and entirely without drama, which made the account more damning than any theatrical presentation could have. Drama invited response and debate. Facts laid out in sequence invited only the question of what you were going to do about them. Calder, Crow's Billings lawyer, had ridden out for the meeting. He was a tall, composed man with the air of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and had learned to treat them as performances rather than confrontations. He raised 3 objections to Whitfield's presentation: procedural, technical, and one regarding the admissibility of Trace's field documentation, all of which Whitfield had anticipated and answered without consulting his notes. Birch spoke next. He confined himself to facts: the filing, the investigation, the ongoing territorial proceeding. He noted that Reeves, the man connected to Crow's operation, who had left the valley in March, was now the subject of an inquiry in the next county over for a separate but related property scheme. He said this without editorial comment, and the room received it without noise, which was the sound of people putting things together. Then Hargrove spoke. He was not a man who had ever needed to perform authority. He had too much of the genuine article to bother with the performance. He stood and said what he had apparently decided to say in the spare, unornamented language of a man who was not interested in being admired for how he said it. He said that Silas Crow had tried to use the community's existing doubts about Caleb Voss's marriage as a cover for a theft operation, that he had manufactured legal documents to cloud the title of a neighbor's land, that he had cultivated connections with a county judge for the purpose of insulating himself from legal accountability, and that these were not the actions of a man with a legitimate dispute or a reasonable grievance. They were the actions of a man who had decided that the valley and its people were resources to be used. "I've done business with you, Silas," Hargrove said, looking across the table directly, "and I'm telling you now, in front of everyone in this valley who matters, that I won't again." The silence that followed had a specific texture, not shocked, not triumphant, but the particular quiet of a room in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and that everyone present understands cannot be unsaid. Silas Crow looked at Hargrove for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara, which was interesting. Not at Caleb, at Mara. With an expression that was controlled and cold and contained something that was almost respect, in the way that a man who has been outmaneuvered can respect the thing that outmaneuvered him without being able to admit it. He said nothing. He stood, gathered his coat, and left the meeting with Calder behind him, and the door closing on his exit was the quietest thing that had happened in that room all evening. It was not over. Caleb knew that, and so did everyone else in the room. The territorial proceedings would continue for months. Crow still owned his land and his money and his Billings lawyer, and the legal machinery moved at its own pace regardless of what happened in community halls. But something had broken in the social architecture of Red Hollow that evening. The silence that had allowed Silas Crow to operate, the collective willingness to look away from what he was doing because he was powerful and it was easier, had cracked open. Things were visible now that had been easier to not see before. The county commissioner's men stayed late, talking with Birch and Whitfield. The Valley families moved around the room in the way of people recalibrating after a significant event, the conversations quieter and more careful than the pre-meeting talk had been. Clara Price found Mara near the side wall, and they talked for 15 minutes, and Caleb watched from across the room as Clara's expression moved through several things. Something that might have been the beginning of an apology, or at least the recognition that an apology was owed, and Mara listened and responded with the careful non-performance of someone who had decided to meet the moment without making it bigger than it was. On the ride home, the night was warm and the stars were clear, and the road was familiar enough that the horses moved along it without much direction. Calder will file a response within the week, Mara said. Yes, Caleb said, and it'll still run through fall. Probably winter, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Hargrove surprised me, she said. He surprised me too, Caleb said. Not what he said, the way he said it, without looking for credit. Men who have a lot of credit don't need to look for it, she said. Is that cynical or just true? She thought about it. Both, she said. He laughed, which surprised them both slightly. Not because laughter was unusual, but because it arrived naturally, without effort, and that was still occasionally something to notice. The territorial court proceedings ran through the summer and into fall, exactly as anticipated. Calder filed his responses and Whitfield answered them, and the process ground forward in the way of legal processes that are not dramatic but are real, and the real ones eventually concluded. The cattle theft case was heard in August by a territorial judge who was not Judge Farrow, a jurisdictional arrangement that Whitfield had worked to establish early and that Hargrove's statement to the court commissioner had helped secure. The evidence was clean and documented, and the 3 Voss cattle bearing Caleb's brand found in the mountain enclosure were the kind of physical fact that legal arguments could circle but not dissolve. The ruling came in September. Silas Crow was found liable for the cattle theft and ordered to pay restitution for all documented losses. Not just the 3 animals found, but the full count established by Caleb's ledger records and corroborated by Birch's investigation. The land claim suit was dismissed with prejudice in October after Pruitt's testimony about the 1871 survey requirements was entered into the territorial record, and Calder failed to produce the original document for inspection because there was no original document to produce. It did not ruin Silas Crow. A man with his resources and his land could absorb the financial penalties and the legal defeat and continue, and he did. He pulled back from the valley's social life, stopped attending the public meetings, ceased the visits to the saloon that had functioned as his informal court. He sold a section of his eastern land in November, not under duress or not entirely, but with the calculation of a man reducing his exposure and consolidating his position for a different kind of fight, one that would be slower and quieter and conducted from a distance. Caleb expected that fight to come eventually, in some form he couldn't predict yet, and he prepared for it by continuing to do exactly what he'd been doing, running his ranch well, documenting everything, maintaining relationships with the people who had chosen the right side for the right reasons. Reeves was found in December, in a territory 300 miles east, and what they found with him was a record of 4 similar operations across 2 years, all of them involving the systematic theft of livestock from isolated ranchers using the same technique of cut fences, small group movements, and mountain passage routes that didn't appear on standard maps. The scope of it. When Birch received the territorial investigator's report and shared it with Caleb and Whitfield, was larger than any of them had fully understood. Silas Crow's name appeared 3 times in Reeves's recorded statements, twice in a context that would have been straightforwardly criminal, and once in a context that Calder managed to successfully complicate. The criminal investigation ran parallel to the civil proceedings, and the outcome of it was a separate question that would take longer to resolve. But it was a question that was now being asked officially and on the record, which was its own form of accountability. The fall harvest was the best the Voss Ranch had seen in 6 years. Caleb said so to no one in particular, standing in the south field in October with the air cold and the crop done and the numbers in the ledger clear and honest. Porter was beside him and said something about the drainage system, which was true. The field drainage had held through a wet summer and the root structure was healthy in a way that would compound into next season's yield. Caleb agreed and didn't say what he was thinking, which was that 6 months earlier he had been running these numbers the other way, looking at a shortfall that Silas Crow had engineered and the winter had compounded, and the distance between that version of things and this one felt significant in a way that arithmetic didn't fully capture. He went looking for Mara and found her in the back room with her maps, updating notations from the summer's water tracking. She had been adding to the maps consistently through the year. They were more detailed now, covered more terrain, had accumulated the data of a full seasonal cycle on top of the 4 years she'd built them before coming to the ranch. She'd started teaching Pete the notation system in August, after he asked to learn it, and the maps had begun to function less as one woman's private record of a landscape she'd been studying alone and more as something that belonged to the ranch itself. "Harvest numbers are good," he said from the doorway. "I heard Porter tell Decker," she said, without looking up. "You don't seem particularly surprised." "I'm not," she said. "The field drainage was right. The crop bed was right. The conditions were right." She made a notation. "Good outcomes aren't surprising when the work has been done correctly. They're expected." He stood there for a moment. This was something he'd learned about Mara over the course of the year. She did not experience good results as relief, the way most people did, because she had not experienced bad results as her fault in the way most people would have. She worked toward outcomes she thought were achievable, and when they arrived, she registered them and moved forward, and only the things that broke against her preparation surprised her. It was a different relationship with outcomes than he'd had before, and living close to it had done something to how he worked, some shift toward the same quality of straightforward expectation, which was its own kind of confidence. "There's something I want to show you," she said, setting down the pen. She took a rolled section of the map and spread it on the table. The northwestern terrain, up into the foothills, the section she'd first shown him in the work table room of her small house months before, but there were new notations on it, more extensive than before, and a section he didn't recognize marked in a different pencil. "This parcel," she said, pointing, 12 acres, northeast of the main ridge. It connects the upper grazing land to the lower creek drainage. It's been abandoned since the family that claimed it in the 70s gave it up." She looked at him. "The water access is good, better than anything available on your current northern boundary. If the land were acquired, it would solve the seasonal drainage problem in the north pasture permanently, not just with a diversion channel, but at the source." He looked at the map. The parcel she was indicating was land he'd been aware of as unclaimed territory for years without ever focusing on it specifically. On the map, in Mara's notation system, its relationship to the ranch's existing water management was suddenly clear in a way it hadn't been before. "That would take a territorial land claim process," he said. "Yes," she said. "It would take about 4 months and the filing fees are manageable." She paused. "I've already drafted the preliminary application, if you want to see it." He looked at her. "When did you draft it?" "June," she said. A slight thing moved through her expression, not quite sheepishness, which was too soft a word for Mara, but something adjacent to the acknowledgement that she had perhaps gotten ahead of herself. "I wasn't sure when the right time would be to bring it forward. There was a great deal happening." "There was," he agreed. "The timing seems better now," she said. He looked at the map for another moment. "Let me see the application," he said. She produced it from a folder beneath the map, already organized, already complete in its preliminary form, waiting for the moment when the rest of the year had cleared enough to make it possible. He read through it carefully and found it precise and thorough and laid out in the practical language of someone who had read enough of these documents to understand what a territorial land office needed to see. "We file in January," he said, "after the new year. Give the legal proceedings time to fully settle before we add another process." That's what I thought, she said. He set the application down on the table and looked at her. She was watching him with that direct look, not the weighing look of the early days, which had carried in it the question of whether he was worth the trouble of honest engagement. Something past that. The look of someone who had been in a place long enough to trust it, mostly, in the partial and imperfect way that real trust always worked. You've been planning ahead, he said. I'm always planning ahead, she said. I just don't always tell you how far. The winter came in December and was hard, but not the hard of the previous year, which had carried in it the weight of everything that was unresolved. This winter had a different quality. Still cold, still demanding, but the cold of a season that had no particular grievance with you, just the ordinary demands of weather in a mountain valley. The hands worked through it with the established rhythm of people who knew what they were doing and trusted the systems they were working within. The cattle count was healthy. The field drainage held. The firewood supply was exactly sufficient, which was Porter's domain and a point of personal precision for him. Caleb found him on a January evening when the temperature had dropped to the edge of painful, and the wind was doing the thing it did off the Bitterroot Range that made the windows sound like they were being tested, sitting at the kitchen table with the land application in front of him, and Mara across the table with her own work, and the lamp between them, and the wood stove keeping the room at a temperature that was genuinely comfortable. He thought about the year, not in a summarizing way. He was not naturally a person who summarized, but the way you thought about something when you were inside it, when the distance required for summary wasn't available, and what you had instead was the texture of it, the individual moments that had accumulated into whatever this was. The fence post in October, the diversion channel, the 8 days of work in the cold, the morning she'd walked the Northwest line alone and come back with her hand on the saddle and her eyes carrying the sharpness of something found. The 2 days at the Decker farm, Mara talking to Ruth with a directness she didn't usually extend to people she hadn't known for years. Hargrove on the porch with his hat in his hands. The meeting in the community hall and Silas's face when Hargrove said what he said. The harvest numbers. And underneath all of it, not separate from it but woven through it, visible only in accumulated context, the fact that Mara was still here. That she had stayed not out of obligation or the absence of alternatives, but because this was, against the odds of her history and the valley's first judgment of her, a place where she had decided to be. He understood that this was not a small thing. He understood it better now than he had in October, when he'd asked her to marry him with the honest but incomplete framing of two people being useful to each other. They were that. They were also something else, something that had no good name in the practical vocabulary they both tended to use, and he was not going to try to name it at the kitchen table on a January night, but he was aware of it. The application is ready, he said. She looked up from her work. I know, you've been looking at it for 20 minutes without marking it. I'm reading carefully. You've read it 4 times, she said. What are you thinking about? He considered the question honestly, which was what she deserved. That a year ago I had no idea this conversation was coming, he said. Any of it. She looked at him for a moment. Neither did I, she said. Does that bother you? The not knowing? The way it turned out, he said. She was quiet, and the quiet was not the calculating quiet of early days, but the thoughtful quiet of someone taking a question seriously. No, she said finally. It doesn't bother me. And then, which was unusual for her, does it bother you? Not even slightly, he said. She looked at the lamp between them. Something in her expression softened by one small degree, that incremental opening that happened when she allowed a thing to reach her. She picked up her pen and went back to her work, which was her version of saying something she didn't have words for, and he filed the application in the folder and went back to the supply ledger, and the stove worked steadily and the wind ran itself out against the house without finding a way in. Outside, the valley was under a foot of new snow, the creek running dark beneath its ice cover, the Bitterroot Range invisible in the cloud cover, but present in the way things you know well are present even when you can't see them. Red Hollow was quiet, the particular quiet of a community that had been through something and was now in the after of it, not recovered, not transformed, not any of the clean words, but changed in the ongoing, provisional way that communities actually changed when something real had moved through them. Hargrove had told Caleb in November that 3 families had quietly declined to renew business arrangements with Silas Crow for the coming year. Two of them had not previously had any particular issue with Silas. They had simply looked at what had come out over the year and made a calculation. That was how it worked, usually. Not with speeches or dramatic reversals, but with the quiet reallocation of trust. People deciding in private what they were and weren't willing to be part of. Mara filed the land application in mid-January, in person, at the county office, and the clerk processed it without any of the small hesitations that had once characterized transactions with her in Red Hollow. She came back and reported that the process would take 3 to 4 months and noted, with the flat matter-of-factness that was her natural register, that the clerk had been professional and thorough. Caleb noted that she had not said he was kind or welcoming or that she'd felt at ease, just that he had been professional. It was what she asked for from public interactions. Not warmth, just the ordinary dignity of being processed the same as anyone else. That she now reliably received it was a change from the year before, and she had incorporated it into her expectations without ceremony. The land claim was approved in April. 12 acres, northeast of the main ridge, became part of the Voss Ranch on a Wednesday morning when the ground was thawing and the first real warmth of the year was making itself felt in the south-facing slopes. Caleb rode the boundary of the new parcel with Mara, and they walked the section where the water access was strongest, and she showed him where she planned to redirect the north pasture drainage to take advantage of the natural contours of the terrain, and he could see it. The logic of it was clear on the ground the same way it had been clear on the map, which was what happened when the person drawing the map was working from real knowledge of real land. "This'll take a season to develop properly," she said. "The terrain needs preparation before the drainage channels can be cut." "Summer work," he said. "Most of it," she said. "Some of it fall." They stood on the high point of the new parcel, and the valley was visible below them, the whole of Red Hollow, the thread of the main creek, the irregular patchwork of the ranches and farms, the smoke from the town's chimneys, the road running south toward the county seat. From up here it looked smaller than it felt from inside it, which was always the case with things you were close to. "When I first came to your door," Mara said, not looking at him, looking at the valley, "I thought you were probably like the other men who'd approached my father's land over the years, looking for something to acquire." "Were you wrong?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You were looking for something," she said, "just not what I thought." "What do you think I was looking for?" She looked at him then. The spring light was clear and the air had the particular cleanliness of high ground in April, and her face had the expression that he'd come to think of as her most honest one. Not soft, not guarded, just clear. "Someone who would tell you what for," she said. He remembered the door, he remembered the rasp in her hand and the organized room behind her and the complete absence of performance in the question she'd asked. He had walked back to his horse that day, thinking he'd made an error coming at all, and then thinking he hadn't, and then riding back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. "Yes," he said. "That's what I was looking for." They rode back down to the ranch, and the work of the day resumed. The ordinary and demanding work of running land that required constant attention, and the hands moved through it with the particular competence of people who had been doing the same work together long enough to need less instruction and more trust. Pete had developed into a solid worker over the year, the kind of young man who watched how things were done and then did them the same way without being told twice, which was Caleb's preferred version of learning. Decker had added a skill over the winter. He'd had Mara show him the map notation system at his own request, and had started keeping his own records of the east pasture terrain, which Mara had looked at and said were accurate without elaborating, which was the closest she came to praise. Porter noticed everything, as he always had, and said less about it than he noticed, which was why Caleb trusted him most. In May, Ruth Decker organized a spring gathering at her house. Nothing formal, just families from the valley who had been through a difficult year together and had come to some provisional understanding of each other. She asked Mara to bring the creek maps, and Mara brought them, and 3 hours of an afternoon were spent with 5 families around Ruth's kitchen table looking at the water documentation and talking about the upcoming summer allocation with more collective knowledge than any of them had individually possessed before. Clara Price and Mara sat at one end of the table and worked through the tributary drainage for the eastern properties. And Clara asked questions and Mara answered them, and it looked from across the room like two people who had known each other long enough to skip the early stages of conversation and get directly to the useful part. It was not a transformation. Red Hollow did not transform. No community did. in the clean way that stories sometimes suggested. What happened instead was the accumulation of ordinary moments in which people behaved decently and found that decency was not particularly difficult, and then kept doing it because the habit formed. Silas Crow remained in the valley. His ranch continued to operate. He attended the town council meetings and said little, paid his restitution penalties through Calder without public comment, and moved through Red Hollow with the contained energy of a man who had reclassified his ambitions without abandoning them. The criminal investigation into the wider livestock operation lingered in the territorial courts and would reach its conclusion in its own time. Caleb did not relax his vigilance about the northern boundary or the legal status of his land. He documented everything, as he always had. He kept Birch informed of any irregularity. He maintained his relationship with Whitfield and his relationship with Hargrove and the other families who had chosen correctly when it mattered, and he did not pretend that any of this was finished in any final sense. But the nature of what remained had changed. It was no longer a fight against something threatening to take everything. It was the ordinary ongoing work of protecting what he'd built from the ordinary ongoing pressures that were simply part of living in a contested landscape. That was different. That had a weight he could carry. In June of the following year, Mara teaching water management to the families who'd asked, not formally, not with any pretense of institutional structure, but in the practical, direct way she did everything. She rode out to the properties of the families who wanted help and walked their terrain with them and showed them what she'd learned about the valley's water patterns. And the maps expanded to cover more of the valley than just the Voss land, because the water didn't respect property lines and the knowledge of it only became fully useful when it was shared. Caleb watched this develop over several months without comment, because it didn't need his comment. It was what happened when someone who had been outside the town's notice for years was given room to be what they actually were, and what Mara actually was turned out to be useful in ways that the town had spent 4 years not finding out because it had decided she wasn't worth finding out. He thought about this sometimes, about what the valley had been paying for in those 4 years. Not just the water management problems that had gone partially unsolved, but something less quantifiable. The cost of deciding that a person didn't count before you'd looked at them carefully. He'd done it himself in the early years when Mara had come back to her father's land, and he'd registered her and moved on, because she wasn't someone his daily life touched, and there was always something else to attend to. He'd done it until he'd had a reason to look, and once he'd looked, he couldn't reconstruct how he'd managed not to see it before. That was the thing he couldn't entirely resolve, and he didn't try to. Some things didn't resolve. They just sat with you, informing how you looked at people going forward, which was maybe the only honest outcome for that kind of accounting. On a late afternoon in the second summer, he came in from the north pasture to find Mara at the work table with a new set of papers that were not maps. He stood in the doorway, and she didn't look up, and after a moment she said, "The county school board has asked if I would be willing to consult on their agricultural curriculum." He didn't say anything for a second. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd think about it," she said. "Clara Price sits on the board." She asked, "What are you thinking?" She set down the pen and looked at the papers. "That it would be strange," she said, "being asked. By people who—" She stopped. "It would be strange. That's not a reason not to do it." "No," she said, "it isn't." She picked the pen back up. "I'm going to say yes." He went to wash up from the day's work and thought about the school board, and Clara Price, and the particular path that had run from Mara's door in October 2 years ago to this moment, and how nothing about that path had been clean or straight or free of the kind of difficulty that left marks on people. Mara carried those marks. He could see them in the way she still paused slightly before accepting kindness, still checked the temperature of a room before trusting it, still kept her own counsel on things she was working through until she'd worked through them far enough to present them in a form that didn't require anyone else to manage the process with her. She was not going to become someone different. That was the thing he understood now that he hadn't known to expect at the beginning, that the person he'd seen at the door with the rasp in her hand, the person who had asked him what for, was not a preliminary version of someone warmer and more open who would emerge over time. She was exactly who she was, and who she was had depth and difficulty and the particular steadiness of someone who had been tested by things that would have broken a person with less internal architecture, and he had not married her in spite of those qualities, but because of them, though he hadn't known how to articulate that clearly until the year had shown him what they looked like under sustained pressure. She said yes to the school board. She began the consultations in the fall, riding out to the schoolhouse 2 mornings a week, and she came back from those mornings with a quality of tiredness that was different from work tiredness, more layered, slightly off balance in the way that happened when something required you to be more present to other people than your habits preferred. But she kept going, and the curriculum work developed into something that the county office noted and then asked to expand, and she handled the expansion the same way she handled everything, by preparing thoroughly, delivering what was required, and declining to make anything of it that wasn't already there. Caleb told her, on an evening when she'd come back from the schoolhouse and was at the table with the day's tiredness on her, that she'd done something real. He meant it specifically, and she received it specifically, without deflecting it into something smaller than it was, which was how he knew she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, in the way real learning happened, to let good things land. The valley did not become a simple place. Simple places didn't exist in the territory, or anywhere else, and Red Hollow continued to have its disputes and its tensions and the ordinary low-level friction of people with competing interests living in close proximity to each other. Silas Crow's criminal case reached a partial resolution in the second fall, a settlement that resulted in significant fines and a formal prohibition on certain land acquisition activities for a period of years, which was not the prison sentence some had hoped for, but was a constraint with real teeth. And Calder filed the settlement paperwork with the particular face of a lawyer who had negotiated the best available outcome for a client in a deteriorating position. Birch retired 2 years after the community meeting and was replaced by a younger man from the county seat who had been briefed thoroughly on the valley's history and who came in with what Birch described in his retirement letter to the county commissioner as an excellent foundation of documented precedent. Birch attributed this foundation to the investigation. Caleb knew it was also, in significant part, to Mara's insistence on documentation from the earliest moment. The fence, the terrain, the water, all of it written and witnessed and organized into a form that outlasted the moment of crisis and became the basis for the record that Birch's successor had to work from. Things you documented outlasted. Things you kept in your head died when you did or got distorted in the retelling. Mara had known this before she came to the ranch, because she'd lived through the cost of not having the documentation in the territory dispute that had taken her family's land when she was 16. She'd known it the way you knew things that had cost you something real to learn, and she'd built it into everything she did at the ranch from the first week. And it had mattered in ways neither of them could have fully predicted when she started. This was the truth that didn't get said plainly in the valley's later telling of that period, when people talked about what Mara had done, and what Caleb had chosen, and what had come of it. The stories that circulated tended to emphasize the mountain passage, the blizzard, the physical courage of a woman riding alone into hard country. Those things were real. But the more persistent thing, the thing that had actually built what they'd built, was less dramatic and harder to tell as a story. The diversion channel, correctly calculated before the first snow. The map, 4 years in the making. The fence documentation, witnessed and filed before anyone knew it would matter. The careful, unglamorous work of understanding a piece of land so thoroughly that when someone tried to take it, there was no version of events that could be made to look like anything other than what it was. You couldn't steal from someone who had documented everything. You couldn't erase a person who had made herself legible to the landscape, who had written herself into the terrain so thoroughly that removing her would have required removing the knowledge itself, and the knowledge had already been shared. That was what Caleb had seen at the door. Not her in particular, ma'am. He hadn't known enough about her yet to see her in particular. He'd seen the quality of someone who understood things, who had built that understanding through years of patient and unglamorous attention to the world in front of her, and who was not going to perform her understanding for the approval of people who hadn't yet earned the right to evaluate it. What for? She'd asked. He'd been asking himself the same question about the introductions, the dinners, the carefully arranged afternoons that had felt like transactions dressed as courtship. What for? The question that honest people asked when they wanted to know what they were actually agreeing to, what the real purpose was, what would be left when the performance cleared. He had come back 3 times because she was the first person who had asked it. On the evening of their second anniversary, which was not a date they marked in any ceremonial way because neither of them was built for ceremony, Mara came in from the north pasture with the report that the new drainage channels were holding exactly as planned, and the water access from the additional 12 acres was functioning better than projected. She said this while pulling off her coat and he was at the stove, and he said, "Good." And she sat down at the table and looked at the lamp that was between them, the same way it had always been between them. And they ate supper and talked about the crop schedule for the following week, and whether the east fence needed attention before the season changed. There was nothing in that evening that a person looking for a story would have found interesting. There was nothing dramatic or resolved or neatly concluded. There was a ranch that was running well and two people who had earned that by working for it, and outside the window the Bitterroot Range was doing what it had always done, enormous and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with the people at its feet. And the people at its feet were doing what people did when they had found a way to be standing upright in a hard landscape. They were looking ahead at the next thing that needed to be done, and making a plan for it, and doing the work. Some things looked like nothing and were everything. Some people looked like no one, and turned out to be the whole answer to a question you hadn't known how to ask. The frontier had a way of sorting that out. Not fairly, not quickly, not without cost. But eventually, in the accumulated evidence of seasons, the truth of what things were worth came clear. Mara had always known what she was worth. She'd simply been waiting in a place that hadn't looked at her long enough to find out. Caleb had looked. That was all. That was the whole of it.